The year is 1492, and a man stands alone on the rolling deck of the Santa Maria, his weathered hands gripping the wooden rail as Atlantic waves crash against the hull. Christopher Columbus stares westward into an endless horizon, his eyes fixed on something no one else can see. Around him, his crew whispers anxiously about the impossible distance they've travelled, about the provisions running low, about the madness of sailing into an ocean that supposedly has no end. But Columbus remains unnaturally calm, almost serene, as if he's following an invisible map burned into his memory. He doesn't look like a man gambling his life on a mathematical theory. He looks like a man keeping an appointment. For centuries, historians have told us Columbus miscalculated the Earth's circumference, that he sailed west believing Asia was closer than it actually was, that his success was born from stubborn ignorance and remarkable luck. But what if that story is incomplete? What if Columbus wasn't guessing at all? What if, before he ever convinced Spain to fund his legendary voyage, he already knew something lay beyond the western horizon? Explorers rarely sail blindly into the unknown, especially when their lives, their reputations and their financial futures hang in the balance. So we must ask ourselves, what did Columbus really know, and who told him? To understand the conspiracy that may have shaped the discovery of the New World, we must first travel backward in time to the decades before Columbus ever set foot on Spanish soil. In the late 15th century, one nation dominated the world's oceans with unmatched expertise and jealously guarded secrets. Portugal wasn't just exploring the seas, it was mastering them in ways that would reshape human understanding of the planet itself. While most of Europe still clung to medieval fears of sea monsters and world edges, Portuguese captains were methodically charting coastlines, mapping wind patterns, and pushing further into the Atlantic than anyone had dared before. This wasn't accidental. It was the result of decades of deliberate investment in maritime technology and navigation science, a national project that began with one man's obsessive vision. Prince Henry the Navigator, though he never actually sailed on voyages himself, established a kind of maritime research institute in the Portuguese town of Sagres, gathering the best cartographers, astronomers, and ship designers money could buy. He collected maps from across the known world, Arabic navigation texts, astronomical instruments, and the accumulated knowledge of every sailor who returned from beyond the horizon. Under his patronage, Portuguese shipwrights developed the caravel, a revolutionary vessel design that could sail closer to the wind than anything before it, allowing exploration of coastlines and islands that had been unreachable with older ships. The Portuguese perfected the art of dead reckoning, celestial, navigation using the North Star and sun angles, and the systematic recording of ocean currents, wind patterns, and coastal features. By the time Columbus arrived in Portugal, the Portuguese had already mapped the entire western coast of Africa, established trading posts in places Europeans had never imagined, and were actively searching for a sea route to India that would bypass the Muslim-controlled land routes. Their ships ventured further south along the African coast each year, and more importantly, they ventured further west into the Atlantic Ocean than official records would later suggest. The key to understanding what Portuguese sailors may have discovered lies in a navigation technique they developed out of pure necessity, a pattern they called the volta do mar, the turn of the sea. When Portuguese captains sailed south along the African coast, they discovered that the winds and currents near the shore often worked against them when they tried to return north. The solution, they found, was counterintuitive and required remarkable courage. Instead of hugging the coastline, they would sail far out into the Atlantic Ocean, sometimes hundreds of miles from any known land, swinging in a great arc to catch the westerly winds that would carry them back to Portugal. This wasn't a casual day trip into open water. Ships following the Volta do Mar route would spend weeks in the deep Atlantic, far beyond sight of land, navigating by stars and dead, reckoning through zones of ocean that maps labelled as empty. But here's what official histories often gloss over. When you sail that far into the Atlantic following those wind patterns and currents, you don't stay in empty ocean forever. The same currents that carried Portuguese ships west in their great arsing return voyages also flow naturally toward the Caribbean, and the coast of Brazil. The same trade winds that fill sails on the Volta do Mar blow steadily toward the Americas, Portuguese captains spending weeks and sometimes months in these Atlantic zones would have been in prime position to encounter the first signs of Western land, even if they weren't looking for it. A ship caught in a storm, blown off course during a Volta do Mar return. A captain who pushed a little further west than usual, testing the boundaries of the wind system. An expedition that miscalculated and found itself much further from Africa than intended. Any of these scenarios could have resulted in Portuguese sailors sighting land, or at minimum encountering unmistakable evidence that land existed somewhere beyond the western horizon. And if they did, what would they have done with that information? In the maritime taverns and dockyards of 15th century Portugal, stories circulated among sailors like currency. These weren't the fantastical tales of sea serpents and mermaids that filled popular imagination. These were quieter observations, strange details that experienced sailors shared in low voices, uncertain what to make of them, but convinced they meant something. Captains returning from long Atlantic voyages reported seeing birds far from any known land, species they didn't recognize, flying steadily westward as if they knew exactly where they were going. Birds have to land somewhere. They have to rest, to nest, to feed. If birds were flying west into the supposed emptiness of the Atlantic, then either they were suicidal, or they knew about land that Europeans didn't. Then there was the driftwood. Not just any driftwood, but carved pieces, worked timber, fragments that clearly showed tool marks. This debris would wash up on the beaches of the Azores and Madeira, Portuguese island chains in the Atlantic. The wood types didn't match European or African species. The carving styles didn't match any known culture. If this wood was floating across the Atlantic, it had to originate somewhere, and that somewhere had to have people skilled enough to shape it. Sailors also reported strange vegetation, floating in certain Atlantic zones, great mats of seaweed and plant material unlike anything found near Europe or Africa. The Sargasso Sea, a region of the Atlantic where seaweed collects in vast floating meadows, became a source of particular speculation. What grew this vegetation? Where did it come from? Some captains claimed to have seen what looked like distant mountains on the western horizon during certain sunset conditions, shapes that appeared for moments before disappearing into haze and distance. Were these illusions, tricks of light on ocean swells, or genuine glimpses of land so far away that it lay beyond normal sailing range? The Portuguese monarchy took these reports seriously enough to sponsor expeditions specifically searching for rumoured Atlantic islands. They found some, the Azores, Madeira, the Cape Verde Islands. But the rumours always suggested there was more, something larger, further west, just beyond the reach of ships that weren't quite prepared for the distance. Into this atmosphere of maritime mystery and controlled information came Christopher Columbus, a Genoese merchant sailor who arrived in Portugal sometime around 1476. He wasn't anyone important at first, just another Italian tradesman trying to make his fortune in a foreign country. But Columbus had ambitions, and more importantly, he had a talent for inserting himself into exactly the right social circles. His marriage changed everything. Columbus wed Filipa Moniz Perestrello, daughter of Bartolomeo Perestrello, who had been a Portuguese captain and the first governor of Porto Santo in the Madeira Islands. Through this marriage, Columbus didn't just gain social status. He gained access to his father-in-law's papers, navigation logs, charts, and most crucially, the private knowledge accumulated by a man who had spent years exploring the Atlantic. Bartolomeu Perestrello had been part of Prince Henry the Navigator's circle, one of the trusted captains sent to investigate and colonize Atlantic islands. If anyone possessed unofficial information about what lay further west, it would have been men like Perestrello. Columbus spent years in Portugal, from roughly 1476 to 1485, living in Lisbon and the Atlantic islands, immersed in the centre of Europe's most advanced maritime culture. He sailed on Portuguese ships, possibly including voyages to West Africa and the Atlantic islands. He had access to the royal libraries, the navigation schools, the informal networks of captains and pilots who knew the ocean's secrets. During these years, Columbus became obsessed with the idea of sailing west to reach Asia. He studied classical geography, particularly the works of Ptolemy and the travel accounts of Marco Polo. He corresponded with mathematicians and cosmographers. He made calculations about the Earth's circumference and the distance from Europe to Asia across the Western Ocean. And here's where the official story starts to break down under scrutiny. Columbus's calculations were wrong. Not slightly wrong, but dramatically, embarrassingly wrong. According to Columbus's estimates, the Earth's circumference was roughly 25% smaller than it actually is. He calculated that Japan lay approximately 3,000 nautical miles west of the Canary Islands. The actual distance from the Canaries to Japan, sailing west, is over 10,000 nautical miles, more than 3 times his estimate. He based this miscalculation on a combination of errors, accepting Ptolemy's underestimate of Earth's size, converting Arabic miles to Roman miles incorrectly, and adding Marinus of Tyre's overestimate of Asia's eastward extension. Any educated cosmographer of the era could see these errors. The Portuguese court certainly saw them. So here's the critical question. Was Columbus genuinely that bad at mathematics and geography? Or was he deliberately presenting false calculations to conceal his true reasoning? Consider the alternative interpretation. If Columbus had access to Portuguese information suggesting land existed roughly 3,000 miles west of the Canaries, but that land was unknown territory rather than Asia, he would face a problem. How could he convince monarchs to fund a voyage to unknown land with no guaranteed riches, no trade routes, no strategic value? He couldn't. But if he could frame that same voyage as a shortcut to the wealthy kingdoms of Asia, described by Marco Polo, suddenly the proposition becomes irresistible. The miscalculation from this perspective wasn't incompetence, it was cover. It allowed Columbus to propose a voyage to coordinates he had reason to believe contained land, while promising his sponsors that land would be the Indies, China and Japan. Whether the land turned out to be Asia or something else, he would have achieved his goal, reaching the western land and claiming the glory of discovery. The Portuguese rejection of Columbus's proposal takes on new significance in this light. When Columbus presented his plan to King John II of Portugal around 1484, the Portuguese court subjected it to review by a committee of mathematical experts. They rejected it, officially because his calculations were obviously wrong, and the voyage would be impossible. But conspiracy theorists ask a more pointed question. What if Portugal rejected Columbus because they already knew what lay to the west, and they knew it wasn't Asia? If Portugal possessed secret knowledge of western land, they would have every reason to suppress that information and reject Columbus's proposal. Portugal's power in the 15th century rested on their monopoly of maritime trade routes and exploration. They had spent decades and enormous resources mapping the African coast, searching for the sea route to India. If word got out that land existed to the west, especially land that might offer an alternative route to Asia, or valuable resources of its own, every maritime power in Europe would launch western expeditions. Portugal's carefully maintained advantage would evaporate overnight. From a strategic perspective, the smart play would be to keep western discoveries classified, discourage other nations from western exploration by supporting the traditional view that the Western Ocean was impossibly vast, and quietly maintain the option of claiming those western lands when the political situation made it advantageous. Columbus's proposal would have been a nightmare for this strategy. Here was a foreigner, armed with suspiciously confident plans to sail west, proposing to do so under Portuguese flag. If he succeeded and found land, the secret would be exposed. If he failed and died, Portugal would face criticism for wasting resources on a doomed venture. The safest option was to reject him and hope he gave up. But Columbus didn't give up. He took his proposal to Spain. Spain in the late 15th century was a nation in transition, newly unified through the marriage of Queen Isabella of Castile and King Ferdinand of Aragon, fresh from completing the Reconquista by conquering the last Muslim kingdom in Iberia. Spain had ambitions to match Portugal's maritime empire, but lacked Portugal's head start in navigation and exploration. When Columbus approached the Spanish court in 1486, he was offering them something irresistible: a chance to leapfrog Portugal's decades of African coastal exploration and strike directly at the riches of Asia. The Spanish monarchs were interested but cautious. They subjected Columbus's proposal to their own committee review, which also determined his calculations were wrong. But unlike Portugal, Spain was willing to gamble. After years of lobbying, political manoeuvring, and waiting for Spain to finish its war with Granada, Columbus finally secured funding in 1492. The terms he negotiated were extraordinary. He would be made admiral of the ocean sea, governor of any lands he discovered, and entitled to 10% of any wealth generated. These weren't the terms of a merchant hiring a ship captain. These were the terms of a visionary who had convinced desperate sponsors that he could deliver something revolutionary. Spain was betting that even if Columbus's math was wrong, even if Asia wasn't as close as he claimed, the voyage might still discover something valuable. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known unless someone told them, was that Columbus might have been sailing with information Spain's rivals wanted kept secret. The conspiracy theory suggests Spain was unknowingly funding a voyage based on Portuguese intelligence, and Portugal was allowing it because they calculated they could still claim the discovered lands through diplomatic and legal means after the fact. On August 3rd, 1492, 3 ships departed from Palos de la Frontera in southern Spain. The Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Niña carried a total of roughly 90 men into the Atlantic Ocean on a voyage that would either make Columbus the most celebrated explorer in history or add his name to the list of sailors who vanished beyond the horizon and never returned. The first leg of the journey took them to the Canary Islands, a standard departure point for Atlantic voyages, where they restocked supplies and made final repairs. On September 6th, they departed the Canaries and sailed west into open ocean, following the latitude that Columbus had determined would carry them to his promised destination. The crossing should have been terrifying for the crew. These were experienced sailors, but experience taught them that land was precious and ocean was dangerous. Every day that passed without sight of shore was another day further from safety, further from any chance of rescue if something went wrong, deeper into an ocean that might have no western boundary at all. As the days stretched into weeks, the crew's anxiety grew into fear, then into near mutiny. They had sailed further west than any voyage they knew of. The provisions were holding, but the psychological weight of the endless ocean was crushing their morale. But Columbus remained calm. Not just calm, but confident in a way that seemed to baffle his officers. He reassured the crew that land was near, that they were on course, that everything was proceeding according to plan. He kept 2 logs of the journey, one accurate record for himself and one falsified record that underreported their westward distance to keep the crew from panicking about how far from Spain they had travelled. This deception is documented historical fact. The question is, why was he so certain his reassurances weren't lies? If Columbus was sailing blind, gambling on bad mathematics and hope, his confidence makes no sense. A man betting his life on a wild theory doesn't act serene while his crew threatens mutiny. A man who miscalculated by thousands of miles doesn't calmly promise that land is just ahead. But a man who has reason to believe land exists at approximately the distance he's travelled, a man who is following intelligence rather than theory, might act exactly as Columbus did. He would expect to find land. He would know roughly when to expect it based on the distances reported in Portuguese rumours or charts. He would project confidence because, from his perspective, he wasn't hoping for land. He was travelling toward land he had reason to believe existed. On October 12th, 1492, 36 days after leaving the Canary Islands, the lookout on the Pinta spotted land. The expedition had reached the Bahamas, making landfall on an island Columbus named San Salvador. The crew's terror transformed into jubilation. Columbus had done the impossible. He had crossed the ocean sea and found land, precisely as he had promised. But here's what often gets lost in the celebration of that moment. Columbus immediately insisted that the land they found was Asia. Not just vaguely Asian, but specifically the outer islands of the Indies, the archipelagos that Marco Polo had described as lying off the coast of China. He spent weeks exploring the Caribbean islands, searching for the great cities, the Khan's palaces, the vast wealth of the Orient. He interrogated the indigenous Taino people, asking through gestures and broken communication about gold, about powerful kingdoms, about anything that would confirm his claimed destination. The islands didn't match Marco Polo's descriptions. The people didn't look like Polo's Asians. There were no cities, no Chinese merchants, no spice markets. But Columbus insisted, in his logs and his reports back to Spain, that he had reached the outer edges of Asia, and that the mainland with its riches lay just beyond. The conspiracy theory offers an explanation for this strange insistence. Columbus knew he hadn't reached Asia. He had reached exactly what he expected to. Reach land in the Western Ocean at approximately the distance that Portuguese intelligence had suggested. But he couldn't admit that because his entire pitch to Spain had been based on reaching Asia. If he reported discovering unknown land instead of a route to the Indies, his voyage might be judged a failure, his promised wealth might evaporate, and Spain's interest in funding further expeditions might vanish. So he maintained the fiction, not because he believed it, but because the truth would have been too complicated and too revealing of the information sources he may have relied upon. While Columbus was still exploring the Caribbean, convinced or pretending that he had reached Asia, the Spanish and Portuguese courts were already planning for the diplomatic aftermath of his discovery. In 1493, Pope Alexander VI, who was Spanish by birth, issued a papal bull that drew a line of demarcation in the Atlantic Ocean, essentially dividing all newly discovered lands between Spain and Portugal. Everything west of the line would belong to Spain, everything east to Portugal. This papal decree was meant to prevent conflict between the two Catholic powers, but it created more problems than it solved. Portugal objected immediately, and not just because the division seemed to favour Spain. Portugal demanded that the line be moved. They wanted it shifted significantly westward, cutting off a large section of what would turn out to be the South American continent. Think about that for a moment. Portugal was fighting to adjust a boundary meant to divide newly discovered lands. But at this point in 1493, what lands had actually been discovered? Columbus had found some Caribbean islands that he claimed were Asian. There had been no exploration of any continental landmass in the west. The official position was that Columbus had reached the Indies, which meant the Indies belonged to Spain, and Portugal should be content with their African roots. So why was Portugal so insistent on moving a line that supposedly only affected Spanish claims to Asian islands? The conspiracy theory offers a stark answer. Portugal knew something Spain didn't. They knew that a large continental landmass existed in the Western Atlantic, and they knew approximately where it was located. They were negotiating for territory they had knowledge of but hadn't officially claimed. The result of these negotiations was the Treaty of Tordesillas, signed in June of 1494. The treaty moved the line of demarcation 270 leagues further west than the Pope's original line, roughly 46 degrees 30 minutes west longitude in modern terms. This adjustment had massive historical consequences. It placed the eastern portion of South America, including what would become Brazil, on Portugal's side of the line. When you look at a map of the Americas with the Tordesillas line drawn on it, you can see exactly what Portugal secured: a huge section of the South American continent, containing some of the richest agricultural and mineral resources in the New World. But again, this treaty was signed in 1494, years before any European had officially sighted the South American mainland, and 6 years before Portugal would officially discover Brazil. How did Portugal know to negotiate for that specific adjustment? How did they know that moving the line westward would gain them valuable continental territory rather than just more empty ocean? The official explanation is that Portugal simply wanted more room for manoeuvring as they explored their African and Indian routes, that the adjustment was about maritime space rather than land claims. But the conspiracy theory points out that this explanation requires us to believe Portugal fought hard diplomatic battles for ocean space they didn't need, and coincidentally ended up with the exact territorial adjustment necessary to claim a continent they supposedly didn't know existed. The alternative is that Portugal knew, or strongly suspected, that land existed in that western zone, and they were securing legal claim to it before circumstances forced them to reveal their knowledge. 6 years after the Treaty of Tordesillas, in the year 1500, a Portuguese fleet under the command of Pedro Cabral, was sailing from Lisbon to India, following the established route around Africa. This was supposed to be a routine voyage by the standards of the time, taking Portuguese trade goods to the Indian markets that Vasco da Gama had opened to European commerce just 2 years earlier. But Cabral's fleet didn't follow the expected route. Instead of sailing south along the African coast, the fleet swung far to the west, much further than the Volta do Mar technique required. On April 22nd, 1500, Cabral's lookout spotted land. The fleet had reached the coast of what is now Brazil, specifically a region that would later be called Porto Seguro. Cabral claimed the land for Portugal, sent a ship back to Lisbon with news of the discovery, and then continued on to India as if this western detour had been a minor interruption. The official story calls this an accidental discovery, an unintended consequence of sailing too far west while trying to catch the winds for the African route. But conspiracy theorists have questioned this narrative for centuries, and their skepticism isn't baseless. First, consider the route itself. Experienced Portuguese pilots knew the Volta do Mar technique intimately by 1500. They had been using it for decades. The amount of westward deviation necessary to reach Brazil from the normal route is substantial, far beyond what any navigation error or wind pattern would naturally cause. A ship blown off course might drift 100 miles west. Cabral's fleet ended up nearly 2,000 miles west of the African coast. That's not a navigation error, that's a deliberate course. Second, consider the timing. Cabral reached Brazil just 6 years after the Treaty of Tordesillas, and Brazil fell neatly on Portugal's side of the treaty line. If this was truly a random accident, then Portugal had extraordinarily good fortune to accidentally discover a massive territory exactly within the boundaries they had insisted on during treaty negotiations. Third, consider Cabral's reaction. He didn't act surprised. He didn't spend weeks exploring or trying to determine what he had found. He claimed the land efficiently, documented it, sent word home, and continued his primary mission to India. This is the behaviour of a man completing a planned task, not a man shocked by an unexpected discovery. The conspiracy theory suggests Cabral's voyage was actually a planned revelation, the official discovery of land Portugal had known about for years or decades. The timing was politically convenient. Spain was distracted by Columbus's discoveries and the complexities of Caribbean colonization. The treaty line was legally established and internationally recognised. Portugal could now publicly claim Brazil without revealing how long they had actually known about it, and without admitting that the treaty negotiations had been based on secret information. This theory gained support from details in Cabral's own log and in contemporary Portuguese documents. Cabral's course was recorded and authorised by the Portuguese crown before departure. He wasn't sailing alone with discretion to choose his route, he was following official instructions. Those instructions took him on a westward deviation that makes no sense unless the destination was intentional. Some historians have found references in Portuguese documents to western lands before 1500, vague mentions that could be interpreted as knowledge of Brazil before Cabral's official discovery. The evidence isn't conclusive, but it's suggestive enough to keep the conspiracy theory alive. What makes the theory particularly compelling is that it explains several otherwise puzzling historical facts. Why Portugal fought for a western treaty line when they supposedly had no western interests. Why Cabral's route was so dramatically westward. Why his discovery fell so conveniently within Portuguese treaty territory, and why Portugal moved so quickly to colonise Brazil despite having limited resources and extensive commitments in Africa and Asia. If Brazil was a genuine surprise, Portugal should have been overwhelmed by the sudden addition of a continental territory to their colonial portfolio. Instead, they acted like they had been planning for it. Behind these questions of treaties and voyages lies a darker possibility. That the age of discovery wasn't really about discovery at all, but about the carefully managed revelation of information that powerful interests wanted to control. In the 15th and 16th centuries, maritime knowledge was perhaps the most valuable strategic asset a nation could possess. A map showing a new coastline, a chart documenting reliable wind patterns, a log describing a safe harbour. These weren't just navigation tools, They were state secrets that could determine which nations would become wealthy empires and which would remain secondary powers. Both Spain and Portugal understood this principle and acted on it ruthlessly. They established policies requiring all ship captains to submit their charts and logs to royal authorities upon returning from voyages. They prosecuted sailors who shared navigation information with foreign powers. They published false maps to mislead rivals about their discoveries. The famous Padrón Real, the master map maintained by the Spanish crown, was kept under guard and updated only with officially approved information. Portugal maintained similar secrecy, perhaps even more extreme. Portuguese maritime archives from the 15th century contained suspicious gaps, periods where one would expect extensive documentation but finds almost nothing. Some historians believe Portugal deliberately destroyed records, burning logs and charts that contained information they wanted suppressed. The question is, what were they hiding? The standard answer is that they were hiding the details of their African coastal explorations and their route to India, protecting their spice trade monopoly from European competitors. But the conspiracy theory suggests they might also have been hiding evidence of Western exploration, Atlantic discoveries that predated Columbus and Cabral, knowledge that would have undermined their diplomatic positions and revealed the true extent of their maritime intelligence network. Consider what such suppression would require. Every captain who saw Western land would need to understand that reporting it officially was forbidden. Every pilot who charted Western coastlines would need to keep separate records, one set for official submission and one set for secret archives. Every sailor who witnessed these discoveries would need to remain silent or face severe punishment. This level of coordinated secrecy seems impossible, but history shows us it can be done when the stakes are high enough. The Manhattan Project during World War II involved thousands of people building atomic bombs at secret facilities across America, and the secret held until the bombs were used. The Allied deception operations before D-Day convinced the Germans that the Normandy invasion would occur at a different location, a lie maintained across thousands of military personnel and false intelligence reports. Compared to these modern examples, keeping 15th century maritime secrets might have been relatively simple. The number of people who needed to know the full truth was small. A few dozen trusted captains, the royal cartographers, key court advisors. The rest of the participants, ordinary sailors and soldiers, would only see fragments of the bigger picture and could be kept in line through a combination of loyalty, fear, and monetary reward. Portugal had every tool necessary to maintain such a secret. A small, centralised government directly involved in maritime affairs, a culture of exploration where following orders and keeping confidences was already expected, financial incentives to reward cooperation, and legal authority to punish betrayal. If they decided that knowledge of Western land needed to remain classified until the political situation made revelation advantageous, they could have maintained that secrecy for decades. The evidence for this conspiracy necessarily remained circumstantial, because direct proof would be exactly the kind of documentation that Portugal would have destroyed. But the circumstantial evidence creates a pattern that's difficult to dismiss. There are the Portuguese navigation techniques that would naturally lead to Western sightings. There are the maritime rumours that circulated before Columbus, stories of strange birds and driftwood and distant glimpses of land. There's Columbus himself, a man with deep Portuguese connections who proposed a voyage with suspiciously specific coordinates, despite impossibly wrong calculations. There's the Treaty of Tordesillas, negotiated to divide lands that supposedly hadn't been discovered yet, with Portugal insisting on boundaries that just happened to perfectly encompass Brazil. There's Cabral's convenient discovery just years after the treaty, his westward deviation far beyond what navigation to India required, his efficient claim and departure behaviour that suggested a planned objective rather than a surprise encounter. And perhaps most tellingly, there's Portugal's immediate commitment to colonising Brazil despite the territory offering no obvious short-term benefit, and despite Portugal's resources being stretched thin by African and Asian ventures. A genuine surprise discovery of that magnitude should have caused hesitation, debate, assessment of costs versus benefits. Instead, Portugal moved on Brazil as if they had been preparing for exactly this moment. When you arrange these facts chronologically and geographically, they suggest a coordinated strategy: suppress early knowledge of Western land, allow a foreign explorer to make a public discovery under a rival's flag, negotiate a treaty that legally secures the most valuable Western territory, and then officially discover that territory once the legal framework is in place. If this was Portugal's strategy, it was brilliant. They avoided the costs and risks of being the first to publicly reveal the New World. They let Spain absorb the initial uncertainties and expenditures of Caribbean exploration, and they secured the single largest and most valuable continuous territory in South America through diplomatic means rather than military conquest. Spain ended up with vast American territories, but also with vast expenses, complex colonial administration, and the burden of maintaining control over dispersed island chains and distant mainlands. Portugal got Brazil, a coherent continental territory that would eventually become one of the richest colonies in the world. Columbus himself remains the most enigmatic figure in this potential conspiracy. If he was truly sailing with Portuguese intelligence, why did he approach Spain instead of insisting that Portugal fund him? One possibility is that Portugal refused him precisely because they wanted deniability. If Columbus sailed under Portuguese flag and discovered Western land, everyone would assume Portugal had known about it all along, which would undermine their diplomatic position and invite competition. But if Columbus sailed under Spanish flag, Portugal could maintain plausible deniability about prior knowledge, while still benefiting from the discovery through the treaty they knew they could negotiate. Columbus might have understood this calculation and accepted it, knowing that Spanish funding was his only path to actually making the voyage, and that his fame and fortune would come from the discovery itself regardless of which flag he sailed under. Another possibility is that Columbus was genuinely in the dark about Portugal's fuller knowledge, that he had access to enough fragmentary information through his Portuguese connections to believe land existed, but didn't understand that he was part of a larger strategic game. From this perspective, Columbus was a useful pawn who genuinely believed in his Asian destination theory, whose miscalculations were sincere errors, and whose success was the result of following partial intelligence that he misinterpreted. Portugal could have deliberately leaked certain information into maritime circles, knowing that ambitious sailors like Columbus might pick it up and act on it, creating the perfect scenario for officially discovering Western lands under foreign auspices. The truth about Columbus's knowledge and motivations probably died with him. His later writings show increasing bitterness about how Spain treated him, how his promised titles and wealth were gradually stripped away, how other explorers claimed credit for discoveries in territories he believed he had opened. He died in 1506, still officially maintaining that he had reached Asia, still insisting that Cuba was part of the Asian mainland despite growing evidence to the contrary. Was this stubborn delusion, cynical deception to protect his legacy, or faithful maintenance of a cover story he had committed to decades earlier? We can only speculate. In the centuries since, researchers have periodically investigated the conspiracy theory, looking for the smoking gun evidence that would prove Portugal knew about the Americas before Columbus. Some have searched Portuguese archives for the suppressed charts and logs that the theory predicts must have existed. These searches have found tantalizing hints, but nothing definitive. There are gaps in the archives where documents should exist but don't. There are references in some surviving documents to materials that have since disappeared. There are maps from the early 1500s that show American coastlines with suspicious accuracy for territories that had supposedly been explored only briefly. The Cantino Planisphere, a Portuguese map from 1502, shows the Caribbean and Brazilian coast in remarkable detail, far more than Cabral's brief landing and Columbus's island explorations should have produced. Conspiracy theorists argue this suggests the map was based on earlier, more extensive exploration that wasn't officially documented. Conventional historians counter that cartographers of the era often filled in unknown areas with educated guesses, and the Cantino map's accuracy could be coincidental or based on rapid information sharing between early expeditions. The scientific evidence has been more intriguing. Studies of Atlantic wind and current patterns confirm that Portuguese ships following the Volta do Mar could easily end up in Brazilian waters without intending to. Computer models of 15th century ship routes show that certain wind and current conditions would push vessels westward with remarkable consistency. This proves the conspiracy theory's claim that accidental discovery was possible, but it doesn't prove that it actually happened before the official dates. Bird migration studies have shown that several species do fly from Africa across the Atlantic to South America, following routes that would have taken them over Portuguese shipping lanes. The strange birds that sailors reported could have been actual migratory species, which means observers who noted them flying westward were witnessing genuine evidence of western land, even if they didn't understand what they were seeing. Driftwood analysis has been less conclusive. While it's true that timber and vegetation from the Americas could drift across the Atlantic given enough time and the right currents, dating such artefacts to prove they reached European hands before 1492 has proven difficult. The evidence exists, but it's not definitive enough to override the mainstream historical narrative. What would it mean if the conspiracy theory is true? If Portugal did possess knowledge of the Americas before Columbus? If the Treaty of Tordesillas was negotiated with secret information? If Cabral's discovery was a planned revelation rather than an accident, then the story we tell about the Age of Discovery changes fundamentally. It stops being a tale of brave explorers venturing into the unknown and becomes instead a story of information warfare, strategic deception, and carefully managed revelation. It means that one of history's greatest adventures was actually a bureaucratic operation, that the romance of discovery was cover for calculated geopolitics, and that the explorers we celebrate as visionaries were possibly pawns or participants in a scheme much larger than their individual voyages. This interpretation doesn't diminish the genuine courage required to cross the Atlantic in 15th century ships, or the real dangers that sailors faced, or the enormous consequences that followed from European contact with the Americas. But it does shift our understanding of who knew what and when, and it highlights how history is often written to serve the interests of those in power, rather than to reveal the complete truth. If powerful nations in the 15th century could keep secrets about entire continents, if they could manipulate the historical record to serve their strategic interests, then we must ask what other accepted narratives might be incomplete or deliberately misleading. The conspiracy theory about Columbus and Portugal isn't really about maps and ships and dates. It's about the nature of knowledge itself, about who gets to decide what information is shared and what remains hidden, about how the official story of any event is just, one version among many possibilities, shaped by the people who had the power to control the narrative. The deeper we examine the Portuguese maritime system of the 15th century, the more we realise how perfectly positioned they were to discover and conceal knowledge of the Americas. The Portuguese court operated what amounted to a centralised intelligence network for maritime information. Every captain returning from a voyage was required to report to the Casa da Guiné, the royal house that managed African trade and exploration. There, royal cartographers would debrief the captains, extracting every detail about coastlines, currents, winds, depths, and any unusual sightings. This information was then incorporated into the master charts kept under royal control, but not all information made it into the official record. The Portuguese developed a sophisticated system of classification for maritime intelligence. Some discoveries were recorded in public documents that could be shared with allies or used for diplomatic purposes. Other discoveries were recorded only in secret charts that remained in restricted archives. And some discoveries, the most sensitive ones, may have been recorded only in the memories of trusted advisors, or destroyed entirely after the strategic value had been extracted. This system gave Portugal enormous flexibility in managing what the rest of Europe knew about oceanic exploration. They could reveal discoveries when it served their interests and conceal discoveries when revelation would have invited competition or complicated diplomatic situations. The infrastructure for such a conspiracy wasn't just possible in 15th century Portugal, it was already in place and functioning for the documented purpose of protecting trade secrets. Extending that system to conceal knowledge of Western lands would have required no new mechanisms, just a decision to classify certain Atlantic discoveries at the highest level of secrecy. Consider also the economic incentives that would have motivated such secrecy. Portugal in the late 15th century was heavily invested in the African route to India. They had spent decades mapping the African coast, establishing trading posts, negotiating with African kingdoms, and searching for the passage around the southern tip of Africa that would give them access to the Indian Ocean. The Crown had poured enormous resources into this enterprise, and by the 1480s they were close to success. Vasco da Gama would finally reach India via the African route in 1498, opening the spice trade that would make Portugal wealthy beyond imagination. Now imagine that Portuguese sailors had discovered Western land in the 1470s or early 1480s, before the African route was secured. What would the rational response have been? Publicly announcing the Western discovery would have immediately diverted attention and resources away from the African venture. Every maritime power in Europe would have launched Western expeditions, creating a rush for new territories and potentially disrupting the careful diplomatic framework Portugal had built for its African operations. Rival powers might have beaten Portugal to the Indian Ocean while Portugal was distracted by Western colonization. From a strategic perspective, the smart play would have been to classify the Western discovery, continue pursuing the African route to its conclusion, and only reveal the Western lands once Portugal had secured its primary objective in the Indian Ocean, and established the legal framework to claim Western territory without military competition. This is exactly the pattern we see in the historical record. Portugal focuses exclusively on Africa and India until Vasco da Gama's successful voyage in 1498, then suddenly shifts attention to the Western Atlantic with Cabral's 1500 expedition. The timing suggests a coordinated strategy rather than a series of fortunate accidents. There's also the question of how Columbus funded his initial years in Spain while lobbying for his expedition. He arrived in Spain around 1486, essentially penniless, after Portugal rejected his proposal, yet he managed to survive for 6 years while repeatedly petitioning the Spanish court, travelling between cities, maintaining a household, and supporting his children. Where did the money come from? The official story suggests he relied on the charity of friends and supporters who believed in his vision, particularly wealthy merchants and sympathetic nobles who gave him lodging and small stipends. But some researchers have suggested a more intriguing possibility, that Columbus was receiving covert financial support from Portuguese sources. If Portugal wanted Columbus to succeed in convincing Spain to fund a Western voyage, they would have had every reason to keep him financially afloat during the lobbying process. A few hundred ducats per year channeled through intermediaries would have been a trivial expense for the Portuguese crown, and it would have ensured that their preferred outcome, a Spanish-funded voyage using Portuguese intelligence, remained viable even as Columbus struggled to convince the Spanish monarchs. There's no direct evidence for Portuguese funding of Columbus during his Spanish years, but the absence of evidence isn't surprising if the funding was deliberately covert. What we do know is that Columbus somehow managed to survive and continue his lobbying efforts, despite having no obvious source of income, which at minimum raises questions about who was supporting him and why. The indigenous peoples of the Americas add another layer of complexity to this conspiracy theory. When Columbus arrived in the Caribbean, he encountered thriving civilizations with their own histories, technologies, and knowledge systems. The Taino people had been navigating the Caribbean for centuries, travelling between islands in sophisticated canoes, trading across vast distances, and maintaining complex social networks. They knew the ocean, understood its currents and winds, and had developed technologies perfectly adapted to their environment. But their perspective on European arrival has been largely lost to history. What we know of the encounter comes almost entirely from European sources, filtered through European assumptions and European agendas. The conspiracy theory about Columbus and Portugal focuses on European knowledge and European secrets, but it's worth considering what the indigenous peoples might have known. Had they ever encountered European ships before Columbus's official arrival? If Portuguese sailors had reached the Caribbean or Brazilian coast in the 1470s or 1480s, would they have made contact with indigenous populations? And if they did, would those populations have preserved stories of the encounter, oral histories that might have been recorded by later Europeans but dismissed as confused mythology? Some researchers have claimed to find indigenous legends that seem to describe European visitors arriving before Columbus, stories of pale-skinned bearded men arriving in great ships, sometimes interpreted as gods or spirits. Mainstream historians tend to dismiss these claims as either fabrications or misinterpretations of indigenous mythology that had nothing to do with Europeans. But if Portuguese sailors did make landfall in the Americas before 1492, even briefly, it's plausible that indigenous peoples would have remembered and stories would have been passed down, creating exactly the kind of ambiguous legends that we find in the historical record. The technological capabilities of 15th century Portuguese ships also support the possibility of pre-Columbian Atlantic crossing. The caravel, the revolutionary ship design that Portuguese engineers perfected, was specifically built for long-distance ocean exploration. These ships were smaller and more manoeuvrable than the older Carrack design, with a combination of square and lateen sails that allowed them to sail much closer to the wind. A skilled crew could make a caravel perform manoeuvres that were impossible in earlier vessels, including sailing against prevailing winds and navigating in coastal shallows that deeper draft ships couldn't enter. The Portuguese had been building and improving caravels since the 1430s, giving them more than 50 years of refinement before Columbus's voyage. By the 1470s and 1480s, Portuguese caravels were the most advanced ocean-going vessels in the world, capable of crossing the Atlantic with relative safety if properly provisioned and crewed. The technology for pre-Columbian discovery existed, and it existed specifically in Portuguese hands. The question isn't whether Portuguese ships could have reached the Americas before 1492. The answer is clearly yes. The question is whether any captains were sent to do so, or whether any captains ended up there accidentally and reported what they found. Given the thousands of Portuguese voyages into the Atlantic during this period, the probability of at least one accidental sighting seems high. Whether those sightings were reported and how they were handled remains the mystery. We should also consider the personal characteristics of the key figures in this conspiracy theory. Columbus was by all accounts an ambitious, secretive, and calculating individual. He carefully managed information, keeping false logs to deceive his crew, withholding his true navigation methods even from his officers, and maintaining claims about reaching Asia long after evidence contradicted those claims. He negotiated extraordinarily favourable terms with the Spanish crown, showing sophisticated understanding of how to leverage his knowledge for maximum personal benefit. This isn't the profile of a naive, idealist stumbling onto discovery through lucky mistakes. This is the profile of a strategic operator who understood exactly what information he possessed, how to use it, and how to protect it. King John II of Portugal, who rejected Columbus's proposal, was similarly calculating. Portuguese historians describe him as one of the most effective and ruthless monarchs in Portuguese history, a man who centralised royal power, eliminated noble rivals, and pursued strategic objectives with cold efficiency. He personally oversaw Portuguese exploration policy, understanding its importance to national power. If John II rejected Columbus's proposal, despite knowing that Western land existed, it would have been because he calculated that rejection served Portuguese interests better than acceptance. He wasn't the kind of ruler who would have made such a decision carelessly, or based on insufficient information. Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, who ultimately funded Columbus, were equally sophisticated political operators. They had just completed the Reconquista, unified Spain, and established themselves as major European powers through a combination of military skill and diplomatic manoeuvring. When they decided to fund Columbus after years of hesitation, it wasn't because they suddenly believed his calculations were correct. It was because they decided the potential benefits outweighed the relatively modest cost, and because they may have suspected that Portugal's rejection was suspicious enough to warrant investigation. All of these were intelligent, informed, strategic thinkers operating in a high-stakes environment where information was power and deception was standard practice. The idea that they would have engaged in complex manoeuvres involving secret knowledge, strategic revelation, and calculated deception is entirely consistent with their documented characters and behaviours. The religious dimension of the Age of Discovery adds yet another layer of complexity to the conspiracy theory. The 15th century was a period of intense religious fervour in Catholic Europe. The Reconquista, which Spain completed in 1492 with the conquest of Granada, was framed as a holy war to reclaim Christian lands from Muslim control. The Portuguese exploration of Africa was similarly justified partly as a crusading mission to find the legendary Christian kingdom of Prester John, which European legends located somewhere in Africa or Asia. When Columbus proposed his western voyage, he framed it partly in religious terms, suggesting that reaching Asia from the west would allow Christianity to encircle the Muslim world and facilitate the conversion of the peoples of the Indies. The Pope's involvement in drawing the demarcation line between Spanish and Portuguese discoveries reflected the Church's claim to spiritual authority over the entire world, including lands not yet discovered. But religious justifications could also serve as cover for more worldly motivations. If Portugal possessed secret knowledge of Western lands, they couldn't simply announce their discovery and claim the territory through military occupation. Such a move would have violated the complex web of Christian diplomacy that governed European international relations. But if the discovery could be framed as part of a divinely ordained mission to spread Christianity, if the Pope could be convinced to draw favourable demarcation lines, and if the whole enterprise could be cloaked in religious language about saving souls and expanding Christendom, then the geopolitical manoeuvring became more palatable. Religion wasn't just a motivation for exploration in the 15th century, it was also a tool for legitimising territorial claims and managing international competition among Christian powers. The conspiracy theory suggests that Portugal may have used religious frameworks strategically, employing papal authority to secure legal claim to territories they knew about but couldn't openly claim through military force. Let us examine more closely the specific timeline of events surrounding the Treaty of Tordesillas and its suspicious precision. The Pope's original demarcation line, established by the papal bull Inter Caetera in May 1493, ran roughly 100 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. This line would have given Spain virtually everything in the Americas, with Portugal receiving only a tiny sliver of eastern Brazil, if any Brazilian territory at all. Portugal immediately objected and demanded negotiations. The question we need to ask is, what was Portugal's negotiating position based on? If they truly had no knowledge of what lay beyond the Western Ocean, their objection makes little sense. Spain had just discovered land by sailing west. Spain was claiming that land under the banner of reaching Asia. From Portugal's perspective, if they had no knowledge of Western geography, they should have been focused on protecting their African and future Asian claims, not fighting for empty ocean to the west. But Portugal didn't just object. They fought hard for a specific adjustment, moving the line 270 leagues further west. Not 50 leagues, not 100 leagues, but precisely 270 leagues. When you plot that line on a modern map, it runs almost exactly along the eastern bulge of South America, the section that includes the richest parts of Brazil. The precision is remarkable. If Portugal was simply demanding more ocean space, any westward adjustment should have satisfied them. But they pushed for a specific distance that just happened to capture the maximum Brazilian territory while minimising the ocean space they had to patrol and control. How did they know where to set that line unless they had information about where land existed? The conventional explanation is that Portugal got lucky, that they pushed for the maximum westward adjustment they thought. They could negotiate, and coincidentally that adjustment captured Brazil. But coincidences of this magnitude should make us suspicious, especially when the parties involved were sophisticated political operators with access to the best geographical intelligence available. The Treaty of Tordesillas negotiations themselves reveal interesting details. The treaty was negotiated rapidly by historical standards, concluded in less than a year from the initial papal decree. Both parties had clear objectives and specific demands. The Spanish wanted to protect their Caribbean discoveries and future Western explorations. The Portuguese wanted the line moved significantly westward and wanted provisions that would protect their African route. But there's an interesting asymmetry in the negotiations. Spain was negotiating based on actual discoveries Columbus had made. They had concrete information, islands at specific latitudes, indigenous peoples, resources, territorial claims that needed protection. Portugal was negotiating based on what? If they had no Western discoveries to protect, what exactly were they protecting? The treaty text itself provides some hints. The Portuguese negotiators insisted on language that would give them not just the ocean space west of the new line, but any lands that might be discovered in that space. They wanted explicit confirmation that discovery rights in the western zone assigned to them would belong exclusively to Portugal, This suggests they anticipated finding land. But how could they anticipate that unless they had reason to believe land existed? The Spanish negotiators, interestingly, don't seem to have fought very hard against the westward adjustment. Some historians suggest this is because Spain was confident that all the valuable lands lay further west than the new line anyway, that they believed the real riches of Asia were much further west, and Portugal was welcome to empty ocean. But there's another possibility, that Spanish intelligence services had begun to suspect Portugal knew more than they were saying, and Spain calculated that accepting the treaty would establish legal precedents they could use later if Portuguese deception was revealed. By agreeing to the treaty, Spain locked in Portugal's claims and created a framework where any Portuguese discovery would have to be shared and verified, making it harder for Portugal to conceal further secrets. Now consider the 6-year gap between the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494 and Cabral's discovery of Brazil in 1500. If Portugal truly didn't know about Brazil, this gap is just a historical accident, time that passed before they happened to send a fleet on a route that accidentally reached South America. But if Portugal did know about Brazil, the gap becomes strategic timing. Between 1494 and 1500, several important things happened. First, Vasco da Gama successfully reached India via the African route in 1498, securing Portugal's primary strategic objective. Second, Spain became increasingly committed to Caribbean colonization, investing resources and attention in their western territories. Third, the international community accepted the Treaty of Tordesillas as the legitimate framework for dividing new discoveries. By 1500, the conditions were perfect for Portugal to officially discover Brazil. They had achieved their main goal with India, they had legal cover through the treaty, and Spain was distracted by other matters. The timing wasn't accidental, it was optimal. Cabral's fleet in 1500 consisted of 13 ships carrying over 1,000 men, an enormous expedition by the standards of the time. This was Portugal's follow-up to Vasco da Gama's successful voyage to India, meant to establish Portuguese trade dominance in the Indian Ocean. The fleet included the best pilots and navigators Portugal possessed. These were men who knew the Atlantic intimately, who had sailed the Volta do Mar dozens of times, who could navigate to within a few miles of intended targets using only stars and dead reckoning. When Cabral's fleet swung westward and reached Brazil, covering nearly 2,000 miles of ocean beyond the normal sailing routes to India, we're supposed to believe this was an error, that the best navigators in Portugal somehow got massively lost on a route they had sailed many times before. The alternative explanation, that they sailed exactly where they intended to sail, seems far more consistent with their documented skills and the suspicious precision of their landfall. There's also evidence in the speed of Portuguese colonization efforts after Cabral's discovery. Brazil was not a high priority for most European powers in the early 1600s, because it lacked the obvious riches of Mexico and Peru. There was no gold immediately visible, no developed civilizations to conquer and exploit, no spices or silk. Brazil offered primarily timber, sugar-growing potential, and strategic location. Yet Portugal moved quickly to establish settlements and begin economic development. They sent follow-up expeditions within a few years of Cabral's landing. They began systematic coastal mapping. They established the factory system that would eventually produce enormous wealth from sugar plantations. This rapid, organised response suggests they had been planning for it, that they already understood Brazil's potential and had determined how to exploit it. If Brazil had truly been a surprise discovery of uncertain value, we would expect to see hesitation, debate about whether colonization was worth the investment, competition with the Indian Ocean trade for resources and attention. Instead, we see decisive action that suggests prior planning. The Portuguese crown granted enormous land grants in Brazil to private individuals and companies willing to colonize and develop the territory, a system they had tested in the Atlantic islands but now deployed on a continental scale. This degree of systematic planning requires time, careful thought, administrative preparation. It's difficult to believe all of this happened spontaneously in response to an accidental discovery. It looks far more like the implementation of plans that had been developed in advance, waiting for the right moment for public revelation. we must also consider the cultural and psychological dimensions of keeping such a conspiracy secret. In the 15th century, the number of people who could read and write was relatively small. Most sailors were illiterate, unable to keep personal records even if they wanted to. The captains and pilots who could write were typically of noble or wealthy merchant backgrounds, men whose loyalty to the crown was reinforced by their social position and economic interests. If the king commanded secrecy, they would keep secrets, not just out of fear of punishment, but because maintaining royal favour was essential to their status and fortune. The Portuguese maritime community was also relatively small and tightly knit. The same families produced generation after generation of sea captains. The same circles trained pilots and navigators. Information flowed through personal relationships and informal networks that were much easier to monitor and control than modern communications. If a captain discovered something sensitive, he would report it to royal officials who knew him personally, who had trained with his father or brother, who moved in the same social circles. This intimacy made secrecy easier to enforce because everyone involved had personal relationships and shared interests in maintaining Portuguese maritime dominance. There was also the simple fact that most people who sailed on these expeditions never returned to Europe. Disease, shipwrecks, combat and desertion meant that only a fraction of crew members who departed on voyages ever made it back to Lisbon. Of those who did return, many died within years from diseases contracted overseas or from the general hazards of maritime life in that era. The number of people who might have witnessed a pre-Columbian discovery of America and survived long enough to potentially reveal that secret would have been very small, possibly dozens rather than hundreds. Managing such a small group of potential witnesses would have been well within the capabilities of Portuguese intelligence services. The linguistics of early American contact provide another intriguing clue. When Columbus arrived in the Caribbean, he attempted to communicate with the Taino people through gestures and by kidnapping some individuals to serve as interpreters. The early Spanish accounts describe this process as difficult and confusing, which is exactly what we would expect from first contact between cultures with no shared language or cultural framework. But there are scattered reports in Portuguese accounts of Cabral's Brazil landing that suggest communication was slightly less difficult than it should have been. Some historians have noted that certain Portuguese sailors seemed to know basic words in indigenous languages, or understood gestures more quickly than first-time contact should allow. These are subtle hints, easily dismissed as misreadings of ambiguous sources, or as the result of indigenous people having encountered other Europeans in the Caribbean whose knowledge had spread through trade networks. But they could also indicate that some Portuguese sailors had previous experience with American indigenous peoples, experience gained during earlier unrecorded voyages. The evidence is too thin to be conclusive, but it adds to the pattern of small anomalies that conspiracy theorists point to as suggesting prior Portuguese contact. Let's examine also what happened to Columbus in the years following his initial voyage. After his triumphant return to Spain in 1493, Columbus was celebrated as a hero. The Spanish crown granted him the titles and privileges they had promised. He was made Admiral of the Ocean Sea and Viceroy of the newly discovered lands. But over the subsequent years, Columbus's position gradually deteriorated. Subsequent voyages in 1493, 1498 and 1502 produced mixed results. He continued to insist he had reached Asia, even as evidence accumulated that these were entirely unknown lands. He proved to be a poor administrator of Spanish colonies, creating conflicts with settlers and indigenous people that required royal intervention. By 1500, Columbus had been arrested by a royal commissioner and sent back to Spain in chains, though he was quickly released and pardoned. He spent his final years petitioning the crown to restore his privileges and honour his original contract, which promised him governorship and a share of profits from the lands he discovered. He died in 1506, partially rehabilitated, but bitter about his treatment. The conventional interpretation is that Columbus was a better explorer than administrator, that he lacked the political skills to manage a colonial enterprise, and that his stubborn insistence on having reached Asia made him seem increasingly delusional and difficult. But there's another possible interpretation, that Columbus knew too much, that Spanish authorities came to suspect he'd been sailing with Portuguese intelligence, and that his fall from grace was partly the result of Spanish concerns about his loyalties and the authenticity of his claims. If Spain discovered or suspected that Columbus had access to Portuguese secrets about Western lands, they would have reason to sideline him, to prevent him from revealing information that would embarrass the Spanish crown and potentially invalidate Spain's claims to the discovered territories. His persistent insistence that he had reached Asia becomes more understandable in this context, not as delusion, but as desperate maintenance of the cover story that justified his original voyage and protected him from accusations of deception. The question of what happened to the pre-Columbian Portuguese charts and logs, if they existed, leads us into the murky world of lost documents and suppressed archives. Historical records are fragile things. Fire, flood, war, and simple neglect have destroyed countless documents over the centuries. But sometimes documents are destroyed deliberately because they contain information that someone once suppressed. Portugal experienced several major archive disasters that could have destroyed evidence of pre-Columbian American discoveries. The most significant was the Lisbon earthquake of 1755, which destroyed much of the city, including royal archives and libraries. Fires, floods, and the chaos of Napoleonic invasions in the early 1800s caused further document losses. By the time modern historians began systematically studying Portuguese exploration records in the late 19th and 20th centuries, many 15th century documents had vanished. What survives is fragmentary, full of gaps and ambiguities. Conspiracy theorists argue that some of these gaps are too convenient, that documents which should exist don't, and that the pattern suggests deliberate culling of sensitive materials before the natural disasters that Portuguese authorities could later blame for the losses. Mainstream historians counter that document loss was normal and random, that we're reading patterns into noise, and that the absence of evidence isn't evidence of conspiracy. Both positions are reasonable, and without the documents themselves we can't determine which interpretation is correct. Modern technology has allowed researchers to investigate some aspects of the conspiracy theory using methods unavailable to earlier historians. Satellite analysis of ocean currents and wind patterns has confirmed that ships following the Volta de Mar route would indeed be pushed toward Brazil under certain seasonal conditions. Computer simulations of 15th century sailing routes, based on documented ship capabilities and known weather patterns, show that accidental landfall on the South American coast was not just possible, but actually probable if ships spent enough time in the deep Atlantic. This strengthens the conspiracy theory's foundational claim that Portuguese sailors could have reached America before Columbus, even accidentally. DNA studies of certain plant and animal species have shown unexpected genetic connections between African and American populations that predate the Columbian exchange, suggesting some biological transfer occurred before official European contact, possibly through natural drift or through unrecorded human contact. Archaeological investigations in Brazil have turned up a few artifacts that some researchers claim show European influence dating to before 1500, though these claims remain highly controversial, and most archaeologists reject them as misidentifications or contamination from later periods. None of this modern research proves the conspiracy theory, but it has gradually made the theory more plausible by demonstrating that the practical requirements for pre-Columbian contact were more easily satisfied than previously believed. Perhaps the most compelling argument for the conspiracy theory comes not from any specific piece of evidence, but from the overall pattern of Portuguese behaviour. Portugal in the 15th century was a nation built on maritime secrecy. Their entire economic model depended on maintaining information monopolies about trade routes, navigation techniques, and geographical discoveries. They had the infrastructure to keep secrets, the motivation to do so, and the documented history of successfully concealing strategically important information from European rivals for years or decades. When we look at how Portugal handled the African route to India, we see exactly this pattern. They explored and mapped for decades before publicly revealing the route. They prosecuted sailors who leaked information to foreigners. They published false maps to mislead competitors, and they used their information advantage to establish monopolies before rivals could compete. This is documented historical fact. The conspiracy theory about pre-Columbian American knowledge simply suggests that Portugal applied the same strategy to Western Atlantic discoveries, using the same tools and methods they provably used elsewhere. When someone has the means, motive and opportunity to commit an act, and when their behaviour matches the pattern they would follow if they committed that act, suspicion is reasonable even without definitive proof. Portugal had the means to discover and conceal knowledge of America before 1492. They had compelling motives to do so, and their documented behaviour in managing Columbus negotiating the Treaty of Tordesillas and discovering Brazil follows precisely the pattern we would expect if they were managing a long-term strategic deception. In the end, we return to that image of Columbus on the deck of the Santa Maria, staring west with confidence that seems either foolish or informed. The historical record gives us facts. He sailed west. He found land. He claimed it for Spain, and the world changed forever. But facts can be arranged in different patterns, interpreted through different frameworks, connected to form different stories. The mainstream narrative says Columbus was a visionary who believed in his calculations despite everyone telling him he was wrong, whose stubbornness and luck led to accidental greatness. The conspiracy narrative says Columbus was following intelligence, that his confidence came from knowledge rather than faith, that he was part of a larger game being played by Portugal to control the timing and context of New World discovery. Both narratives fit, the same facts. Both require us to believe certain things that can't be proven. The mainstream narrative requires us to believe in an extraordinary coincidence that Columbus's wildly incorrect calculations just happened to lead him to land at almost exactly the distance he predicted, and that Portugal just happened to negotiate for treaty boundaries that perfectly encompassed the continent they would accidentally discover 6 years later. The conspiracy narrative requires us to believe in extraordinary secrecy, that Portugal maintained classified knowledge of Western land for years or decades, that they manipulated Columbus and Spain into public discovery while protecting their own interests, and that they destroyed or suppressed evidence thoroughly enough that we can't find definitive proof 5 centuries later. Which version you believe probably says more about your view of human nature and institutional power than about the actual evidence if you believe explorers are fundamentally driven by individual vision and courage, if you believe historical events usually result from open decisions and random chance, then the mainstream narrative will satisfy you. If you believe powerful institutions routinely keep secrets and manipulate events to serve their interests, if you believe official histories are often sanitized versions that hide uncomfortable truths, then the conspiracy narrative will seem more plausible. The Atlantic Ocean still flows along the same current patterns that carried Portuguese sailors west in the 15th century. The trade winds still blow from Africa toward the Americas with the same consistency that would have pushed ships toward Brazil. The Sargasso Sea still collects its strange floating meadows of seaweed in the zone between continents. The birds still migrate across thousands of miles of open water, following routes encrypted in their genetics, connecting lands that human sailors thought were separated by endless ocean. If you stand on the coast of Portugal today and look west, you're looking across the same water that Columbus crossed, across the same horizon that Portuguese captains studied, before deciding what they could say publicly and what they needed to keep secret. The distance hasn't changed, roughly 3,000 nautical miles from the Canaries to the Caribbean, roughly 2,000 miles from the Cape Verde Islands to the Brazilian coast. Close enough that a good ship with favourable winds could make the crossing in a month or two, far enough that no one would attempt it unless they had reason to believe something waited on the other side. The archives in Lisbon and Seville still contain thousands of documents from the Age of Discovery, carefully preserved records of voyages and discoveries and diplomatic negotiations. They also contain gaps, spaces where documents should exist but don't, references to materials that have disappeared, hints of information that never made it into the official record. Historians will continue to search those archives, continue to analyse the evidence, continue to debate whether Columbus knew more than he admitted, and whether Portugal hid what they knew. But unless someone discovers a cache of suppressed Portuguese charts dated before 1492, unless a sailor's private log surfaces with explicit descriptions of pre-Columbian American sightings, Unless some documentary smoking gun emerges from the gaps in the record, the conspiracy theory will remain exactly that. A theory, plausible but unproven. A pattern that fits the facts but can't be definitively confirmed. Perhaps that's fitting. The age of discovery was built on uncertainty, on sailors venturing into zones where their maps showed nothing, on captains making decisions based on fragmentary information and educated guesses, on nations competing for advantages they couldn't fully understand. The uncertainty at the heart of the Columbus conspiracy theory mirrors the uncertainty that drove the whole era. We want clear answers about who knew what and when, just as Columbus wanted clear answers about what lay beyond the western horizon. But history, like the ocean, rarely provides the clarity we seek. It gives us currents and winds, patterns and possibilities, hints that something significant lies just beyond our vision. The truth about Columbus and the secret maps of the Western Ocean may be out there somewhere, waiting in an unopened archive box or encoded in a document that no one has read correctly. Or the truth may be simpler, that Columbus was exactly what he appeared to be, a stubborn sailor with bad math and good luck, and Portugal was simply competent at negotiation and fortunate in their accidental discoveries. We may never know for certain. What we can know is that the official story of any historical event is never the complete story, that powerful interests always shape the narrative to serve their purposes, and that the distance between what happened and what we're told about what happened is sometimes as vast as the Atlantic Ocean itself. Columbus sailed west and found land. That much is certain. Everything else, his motives and knowledge, Portugal's secrets and strategies, the truth behind the treaties and the timing of discoveries, remains suspended in the fog of history, visible in glimpses but never completely clear, like those distant mountains that Portuguese sailors claimed to see on the western horizon. Shapes that appeared for moments before disappearing into haze and distance, promising something beyond but never quite confirming what that something was. The ocean keeps its secrets well, and perhaps we should accept that some mysteries are meant to remain mysteries, not because the truth doesn't exist, but because the truth is so deeply buried beneath centuries of political calculation and strategic deception that recovering it would require us to doubt everything we think we know about how history is made and recorded. Columbus knew something. Portugal knew something. The question is whether what they knew matches what they told us, or whether the real story went to the grave with the sailors who crossed that ocean and the monarchs who sent them, leaving us with only the official version, polished and simplified and incomplete, a map that shows the coastline but hides the currents that carried the ships, a narrative that celebrates the discovery but conceals the conspiracy that made it possible. Picture this. You're flying cargo over the Arctic Circle when your instruments go haywire. The aurora borealis dances above, but something's wrong. The lights pulse in patterns too perfect to be natural. Your cargo manifest says environmental sensors, but the weight matches military hardware. Welcome to tonight's story, where the beautiful northern lights hide a weapons program so classified that even acknowledging its existence could land you in federal prison. Before we dive into Mason Fry's dangerous discovery, drop your suggestions in the comments below, and if you're loving these late-night journeys into the shadows of truth, hit that like button and subscribe to Sleep Theories. Now, kill your lights, settle in, and prepare for a story that will make you question every government environmental project you've ever heard about. Act 1. The Ordinary Job. The de Havilland DHC-5. Buffalo's engines roared against the Arctic wind as Mason Fry guided the old cargo plane through another milk run to nowhere. At 29, he'd traded the structured chaos of Air Force logistics for the supposedly simpler life of civilian freight. But the routes up here, supply runs to research stations scattered across the Canadian Arctic, sometimes made him wonder if he'd actually left military service at all. Yellowknife Control, this is Caribou 779, currently at flight level 180, approximately 200 nautical miles out from Aurora Station. Mason spoke into his headset, the familiar routine of position reports keeping him grounded in the endless white below. Roger 779. Weather holding steady, winds from the northwest at 30 knots. Aurora Station reports ready to receive. Aurora Station. In the 6 months since Mason had started flying for North Star Logistics, he'd made this run twice a month. Officially, it was a joint US-Canadian renewable energy research facility, part of the big push toward Arctic sustainability. The press releases talked about revolutionary methods to harness the Aurora Borealis itself, electromagnetic induction on a massive scale, turning the northern lights into humanity's newest power source. It sounded like science fiction, which is probably why most people dismissed it as another government boondoggle, throwing money at impossible dreams while practical problems went unsolved. But Mason had learned to pay attention to details during his Air Force days, and Aurora Station set off every instinct he'd developed loading classified cargo onto C-130s in Afghanistan. The manifest for today's flight was typical of what had been making him uneasy. 3 pallets of atmospheric monitoring equipment that required reinforced tie-downs typically used for armoured vehicles. 4 crates labelled renewable energy components with handling instructions warning against electromagnetic interference. And most curious, a single container marked only with a NATO stock number and the words "Technical Manual Set, Classified Handling Required." Since when does renewable energy research need classified technical manuals? Mason muttered to his co-pilot Derek Chen, who'd been flying Arctic routes for 15 years. Derek shrugged, focused on monitoring the instruments. Government contracts, man. They classify their toilet paper if they could bill extra for it. But as they descended toward Aurora Station's ice runway, Mason noticed something he'd been tracking for months. His instruments always acted up at exactly the same point in the approach, roughly 5 miles out. The magnetic compass would spin lazily. The radio would fill with static that had an almost rhythmic quality, and the GPS would briefly show their position as somewhere in the South Pacific, before snapping back to reality. The station itself looked unremarkable from the air, a collection of prefab buildings connected by enclosed walkways, some communication towers, and what appeared to be a large solar panel array. But Mason had noticed things. The solar panels were angled wrong for optimal sun exposure at this latitude. The communication towers were too numerous and too varied for a simple research station. And then there were the tyre tracks. Heavy vehicle tracks led from the main cargo receiving area, not to the visible buildings, but to a low mound about 300 metres away. The tracks disappeared at the mound's base, suggesting an entrance hidden beneath the snow. Every delivery the tracks were fresh, but Mason had never seen the vehicles that made them. After landing and supervising the offload, the Aurora Station crew always insisted on handling the cargo themselves with their own equipment. Mason took his usual walk to stretch his legs while Derek handled the paperwork. The station personnel were friendly enough, but had the kind of studied casualness that reminded him of intelligence officers he'd encountered at forward operating bases. They answered questions without really saying anything, smiled without warmth, and always seemed to be watching even when looking away. This time Mason wandered closer to the mysterious mound. As he approached, he felt a vibration through his boots, a low-frequency hum that seemed to come from deep underground. His phone, which had been showing no signal, suddenly blazed to life with full bars before immediately dying. Its battery drained from 60% to 0 in seconds. "You should stick to the marked paths," a voice said behind him. Mason turned to find a woman in Aurora Station gear, her badge identifying her as Emily Reeves, Site Safety Coordinator. Permafrost out here can be unstable. Wouldn't want you falling into a crevasse. Mason looked at the flat, solid ground around them. Right, crevasses. Emily's smile was professional. The Arctic is full of hidden dangers, Mason. Best to stay where it's safe. That night, back in Yellowknife, Mason couldn't shake the feeling that Aurora Station was wrong in ways that went beyond suspicious cargo and hidden entrances. He'd been to legitimate research stations. Scientists were usually eager to talk about their work, proud to show off their equipment. Aurora Station's personnel acted like they were guarding state secrets, which Mason was beginning to suspect they were. He pulled out his laptop and began searching for information about Aurora Station. The official website was slick and professional, full of stock photos of wind turbines and solar panels, with vague descriptions of cutting-edge electromagnetic research and sustainable Arctic development. But when he dug deeper, things got interesting. The station had been established in 2019, but the land lease went back to 1987, originally designated for a communications research facility that was apparently never built. The primary contractor wasn't a renewable energy company, but Atlas Defense Solutions, a firm Mason recognised from his Air Force days. They specialised in electronic warfare systems. His phone rang, showing an unknown number with a Virginia area code. Mason Fry? The voice was professional, crisp. Who's asking? Someone who knows you've been asking questions about Aurora Station. Questions that could be misinterpreted. I'm calling as a courtesy, military to military. Some doors are better left unopened. Is that a threat? It's advice. You have a good job, a clean record, a future. Don't jeopardise that over curiosity about things that don't concern you. The line went dead. Mason stared at his phone, then at his laptop screen showing Atlas Defense Solutions Board of Directors. 3 former Pentagon officials and a retired Air Force general who had overseen strategic defense initiatives. Whatever Aurora Station was really doing up there in the Arctic, it had nothing to do with renewable energy. Act 2. The Anomaly. 2 weeks later, Mason was nursing a beer at the Gold Range, Yellowknife's infamous Strange Range bar, when Tobias Winters slid into the booth across from him. Tobias was what the locals called a radio rat, a ham radio enthusiast who spent his nights listening to signals bouncing off the ionosphere, talking to strangers on the other side of the world from his cabin 20 miles outside town. "You're the pilot who flies to Aurora Station," Tobias said. It wasn't a question. "One of them, yeah." Tobias leaned forward, his eyes bright with the kind of excitement Mason associated with conspiracy theorists and true believers. "I need to show you something, but not here." An hour later, Mason stood in Tobias's cabin, surrounded by enough radio equipment to stock a small broadcast station. Vintage receivers sat next to modern software-defined radios, their displays dancing with waterfall patterns of received signals. The walls were covered with QSL cards, postcards from other radio operators around the world, and maps marked with red pins and string, tracking something Mason couldn't immediately identify. "Listen to this," Tobias said, adjusting dials on receiver. Static filled the room, then cleared to reveal a rhythmic pulsing, almost like a heartbeat, but electronic. "I started picking this up 3 months ago, always at the same time, 0300 UTC, always from the same direction." He pointed to a map where several string lines converged on a point in Nunavut. Aurora Station. "Could be equipment interference," Mason suggested, though he was remembering his instruments going haywire on approach. "That's what I thought. But then I noticed the pattern." Tobias pulled out a notebook filled with timestamps and frequency measurements. The pulses correspond exactly to Aurora Borealis activity. When the northern lights are strong, the pulses are strong. When they're weak, the pulses are weak. So they're studying the aurora. That's what they claim to be doing. Studying? Or harvesting? Tobias flipped to another page. "I've been tracking unexplained blackouts across the Arctic. Small communities, usually lasting just a few minutes, barely making the news, They follow a pattern. He laid a transparent sheet over a map showing dots connected by lines. Every blackout occurs along a line between Aurora Station and wherever the aurora is most active. Mason studied the map, his unease growing. You're saying they're pulling power from the aurora? Or pushing something through it? Watch this. Tobias turned to a computer, pulling up an audio file. This is a transmission I intercepted last week. It's encrypted, but the header was in the clear long enough to identify the sender and recipient. The screen showed sender, Aurora. Actual, recipient, Chrysalis Command. Chrysalis Command? Mason had never heard the designation. Traced it through signal analysis. The response came from a building in Arlington, Virginia. Officially, it's office space leased to a company called Electromagnetic Solutions International. But check this out. Tobias pulled up a corporate registration. ESI is a wholly owned subsidiary of Atlas Defense Solutions. The same company Mason had identified as Aurora Station's primary contractor. There's more, Tobias continued. My friend in Fort Smith, another radio operator, he's been documenting wildlife deaths. Entire flocks of birds falling from the sky, always during or immediately after the pulses, and look at the dates. Mason compared the lists. Every unexplained wildlife death corresponded to a cargo delivery he'd made to Aurora Station. Whatever you're flying up there, Tobias said, it's not environmental sensors. That night Mason couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about those heavy pallets, the classified technical manuals, the underground entrance hidden beneath the snow. At 3 a.m. he gave up and drove to the North Star Logistics warehouse at the airport. The night shift knew him. Didn't question when he said he'd left something in the plane. He made his way to the cargo area where tomorrow's Aurora Station shipment was being staged. Most of the crates were the usual, sealed, labelled with technical descriptions that could mean anything. But one pallet, set apart from the others, made him pause. It was covered with a tarp, but the corner had come loose. Underneath was a cylindrical device about the size of a water heater, made of what looked like copper coiling wrapped around a ceramic core. Stencilled on its side was Resonance Amplifier MK7, and below that, Caution, High Energy Electromagnetic Device. Mason quickly photographed it with his phone, then noticed something else. A shipping label that had partially peeled off, revealing another label underneath. The visible label showed Aurora Station as the destination. The hidden one showed an origin, Los Alamos National Laboratory, Nuclear Weapons Division. His phone suddenly grew hot in his hand. The screen flickered, showing impossible error messages before going completely dead. Not powered off. Dead, as if the electronics had been fried. You shouldn't be here, Mason. He spun to find Emily Reeves, the safety coordinator from Aurora Station, standing in the warehouse doorway. She wasn't wearing Arctic gear now, but black tactical clothing that suggested a very different job description. How did you... We've been monitoring you since your first call to Tobias Winters. We know about his intercepts. We know about your research. And we know you just photographed classified defense equipment. So what now? You disappear me? Emily sighed. Despite what Hollywood would have you believe, we don't disappear curious civilians. Too messy, too many questions. But you put us in a difficult position. You've seen things you shouldn't have seen, connected dots that should have remained scattered. What is Aurora Station really doing? Emily was quiet for a long moment, seeming to weigh her words. Have you ever heard of the Carrington event? 1859. A solar storm so powerful it set telegraph wires on fire, made the aurora visible as far south as the Caribbean. Mason nodded. Now imagine being able to harness that power, to create focused electromagnetic pulses using the aurora as a natural amplifier, not as a weapon, that's thinking too small, as a communication system that can't be intercepted, can't be jammed, can't be traced. A way to send signals through the Earth's magnetic field itself. The blackouts, the dead birds. Regrettable side effects we're working to minimize. The technology is still being perfected. And if I don't keep quiet, then you'll find your life becoming very complicated. Your employer will discover discrepancies in your flight logs. The DEA will receive an anonymous tip about suspicious cargo movements. Your bank will flag your accounts for potential terrorism financing. Emily stepped closer. Or you can forget what you've seen, continue flying your routes, and enjoy the substantial raise North Star Logistics is about to offer you to retain such a valued pilot. Mason looked at the resonance amplifier, at Emily, at the warehouse full of secrets heading north. The people in those communities, the ones experiencing blackouts, they don't get a choice in being your test subjects. No, Emily agreed, or they don't. But then, when has anyone asked the Arctic's opinion about anything? Mining, drilling, missile tests? It's always been humanity's laboratory for things too dangerous to try anywhere else. Act 3. Following the money. Mason took the raise. He kept flying to Aurora Station, but he also started documenting everything. Every manifest got photographed. Every unusual cargo weight got logged. Every instrument anomaly got recorded. He created encrypted backups, stored on servers in countries with no extradition treaties. And late at night he traced money. North Star Logistics, it turned out, was more interesting than he had expected. On paper it was a small Canadian freight company, family-owned for 3 generations, but its primary contract, the Aurora Station runs, paid 10 times the market rate for Arctic cargo delivery. The payments came not from the Canadian government or even directly from Atlas Defence Solutions, but through a web of intermediary companies that took Mason weeks to untangle. The trail led to something called the Electromagnetic Defence Initiative, a Pentagon office that officially existed for only 18 months in 1987 to 1988, during the height of Reagan's Strategic Defence Initiative, the Star Wars program. Officially, the office had been disbanded, its research deemed unfeasible. Unofficially, Mason discovered it had been reconstituted under different names every few years, moving between departments, always maintaining a budget that was small enough to avoid congressional scrutiny, but large enough to fund significant research. The current incarnation was hidden in the Department of Energy's budget as the Arctic Environmental Protection Program, $68 million annually, ostensibly for studying the impact of climate change on polar electromagnetic phenomena. Mason found the smoking gun in a General Accounting Office report from 2003, buried in an appendix about cost overruns. A single line item. Recovery and analysis of foreign technical materials, Operation Northern Light, location, classified Arctic Site 7. Operation Northern Light. Mason searched for any reference to it, finding only fragments. A mention in a Canadian defence document about joint recovery operations. A redacted Air Force report about anomalous satellite debris. And finally, in a declassified CIA assessment of Soviet military capabilities, a single paragraph. The loss of Cosmos 2341 over the Canadian Arctic in 1987 represents a significant intelligence opportunity. The satellite, believed to be testing experimental electromagnetic pulse technology, broke apart at an altitude of 200 kilometres. Debris field analysis suggests primary payload may have survived re-entry. Recovery efforts should be prioritised. Aurora Station sat directly on the projected debris field of Cosmos 2341. Mason met Tobias at a truck stop 50 miles from Yellowknife, away from any potential surveillance. They're not developing their own technology, Mason explained, showing Tobias his findings. They're reverse engineering Soviet EMP weapons that crashed there in 1987. The Aurora isn't just a power source, it's an amplifier for weapons designed to work with the Earth's magnetic field. Tobias studied the documents. This is beyond what I imagined. If they can weaponize the Aurora itself, they could create targeted electromagnetic pulses anywhere in the Northern Hemisphere, knock out power grids, communications, military equipment, and it would look like a natural phenomenon, just a particularly strong interaction between solar wind and the magnetosphere. We need to go public with this. Mason shook his head. With what? Financial records that could be explained as legitimate research funding? Speculation about 30-year-old satellite crashes? They'll deny everything, and will look like conspiracy theorists. Then what do? We get proof. Real, undeniable proof. The opportunity came 3 weeks later. A massive solar storm was forecast, the kind that would set the Aurora blazing across the entire Arctic. Aurora Station requested an emergency supply run. They needed additional equipment to take advantage of optimal conditions for renewable energy testing. Mason volunteered for the flight. The cargo was different this time, smaller, more numerous packages, each one marked with radiation warnings and handling instructions that suggested volatile materials. Derek, his usual co-pilot, had called in sick, replaced at the last minute by someone Mason didn't recognise, a quiet man named Johnson who said little and watched everything. As they approached Aurora Station, the instruments didn't just glitch, they went completely haywire. The compass spun like a tornado, the altimeter showed them at negative altitude, and the radio filled with what sounded like voices speaking backwards. Through the cockpit window, the Aurora wasn't its usual curtain of green light, but geometric patterns, almost like circuit boards drawn in the sky. "Jesus Christ," Johnson muttered, the first genuine emotion Mason had heard from him. They actually did it. That's when Mason realised Johnson wasn't just a replacement pilot. He was here to observe the test. They landed in near whiteout conditions, the Aurora so bright it cast multiple shadows. The Aurora Station crew worked with unusual urgency, unloading the cargo directly onto vehicles that immediately headed toward the hidden entrance Mason had observed months ago. "I need to check something in the cargo hold," Mason told Johnson. "Thought I heard something shift during that turbulence." Johnson looked sceptical but nodded. "Make it quick." "We're wheels up in 30 minutes. Mason made his way to the cargo hold, then slipped out the rear door. The storm provided perfect cover, visibility down to mere meters. He followed the vehicle tracks toward the mound, the vibration through the ground growing stronger with each step. The entrance was exactly where he'd suspected. A ramp leading down, wide enough for vehicles, concealed by camouflage netting covered with snow. Mason descended. His phone, a new one, wrapped in aluminum foil until now, recording everything. The tunnel led to a vast underground chamber, easily the size of an aircraft hangar. But it wasn't the size that stopped Mason in his tracks. It was the contents. Arranged in a precise pattern were dozens of the resonance amplifiers he'd seen in the warehouse, all connected by thick cables to a central platform. On the platform was something that clearly didn't belong to any Earth-based military, a spherical device about 3 meters across, its surface covered in Cyrillic text and symbols that looked more like circuit diagrams than writing. Soviet technology, but advanced beyond anything that should have existed in 1987. Scientists and technicians in hazmat suits swarmed around the equipment, making final adjustments. Mason recognised Emily Reeves, now in military fatigues, speaking into a radio. "Chrysalis Command, this is Aurora Actual. We are T-minus 5 minutes from pulse generation. Target coordinates locked. Grid reference, November 7-7. Communications hub at Fort Greely. Pulse duration 3 seconds, expected downtime 15 minutes, confirm receipt. Fort Greely, home to the US military's missile defense system." Mason recorded everything. The phone's memory filling with evidence of a weapon test disguised as energy research, targeting American military infrastructure. He was so focused on documenting that he almost missed the footsteps behind him. "I really hoped you'd taken our advice," Emily said, flanked by 2 security contractors with rifles. "Now things get complicated." Act 4, The Leak in the Chase. Mason raised his hands, the phone still recording in his chest pocket. "Testing EMP weapons on your own military? That's treason, isn't it?" Emily smiled coldly. "Treason implies working against your country's interests. We're ensuring America maintains electromagnetic superiority in an age where conventional weapons are becoming obsolete. The Fort Greely test is calibrated to create minor repairable disruptions, just enough to test our countermeasures. And the Canadian government? Do they know you're using their territory for weapons testing? The Canadians know exactly what we've told them. that we're researching Aurora-based renewable energy. The underground facility doesn't officially exist." The klaxon sounded. "T-minus 60 seconds, an automated voice announced. "You should see this," Emily said, gesturing toward an observation window. "You've risked everything to learn our secret. Might as well witness history." Through the window, Mason could see the central device beginning to glow. The resonance amplifiers hummed in harmony, creating a sound that seemed to bypass the ears and resonate directly in his bones. Above, through monitors showing external cameras, the aurora twisted into impossible shapes. Spirals, grids, focused beams of light that seemed to reach down toward the earth. 30 seconds. Mason felt his phone growing warm in his pocket, the electromagnetic field beginning to affect its electronics, despite the foil shielding. The Soviet device was supposed to be a doomsday weapon, Emily explained, her eyes fixed on the glowing sphere, able to create a cascade effect through the magnetosphere, knocking out electronics across entire continents. We've refined it, controlled it, turned it into a precision instrument. 10 seconds. The harmonic vibration reached a crescendo. Mason's vision blurred, his inner ear screaming conflicting information about up and down. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Pulse initiated. The sphere erupted in light. Not visible light, but something that made every nerve ending fire at once. The monitors showed the aurora focusing into a column of energy that seemed to punch through the atmosphere itself. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. "Pulse complete. Chrysalis command confirming target impact. Fort Greely communications offline. Secondary effects minimal. Test successful." The technicians erupted in celebration. Emily turned to Mason with satisfaction. 15 minutes from now, Fort Greely's systems will come back online. They'll blame it on solar storm interference. No permanent damage, no evidence, no questions asked. "Except I have everything on video," Mason said. Emily's smile didn't waver. "Your phone died 30 seconds ago. EMP, even the residual field, is hell on electronics." She gestured to the security contractors. "Take him to holding. We'll figure out what to do with him after the team clears out." As they marched him through the facility, Mason mentally catalogued everything. Escape routes, personnel numbers, equipment details. The holding cell was a repurposed storage room, solid walls, electronic lock. They searched him thoroughly, finding the dead phone, his wallet, keys, even the pen from his flight suit. But they didn't find the micro SD card hidden in the heel of his boot, where he'd transferred the video just before the phone died. 4 hours later, the facility had gone quiet. Skeleton crew only, most personnel evacuated after the successful test. Mason had spent the time working on the door's lock mechanism. Electronic, yes, but with a manual override required by fire code. His Air Force survival training had included a week with a CIA operative who taught them things that weren't in any official manual. The lock clicked open just as he heard footsteps approaching. Johnson, the replacement pilot, stood in the hallway. "We need to leave. Now," Johnson said. "Who are you really?" "Canadian Security Intelligence Service. We've suspected Aurora Station's true purpose for 2 years, but couldn't prove it. Your little adventure gave us the excuse to insert assets. This place will be crawling with Canadian military in 6 hours, but you need to be gone before then." They made their way through the facility, now nearly deserted. Johnson had disabled the security cameras, creating a blind spot in the surveillance. At the motor pool, they acquired a snowmobile, Johnson producing keys from his pocket. "They'll notice we're gone within the hour," Johnson said as they raced across the tundra toward the aircraft. "But there's a problem. Your plane's been disabled. They pulled the control circuit breakers." Mason grinned. "They pulled the ones they could see, DHC-5. Buffalo has redundant systems from its military days, hidden behind the cargo panels. Give me 10 minutes. As Mason worked to restore the aircraft's electrical systems, Johnson kept watch. "You have evidence." Mason tapped his boot. "Everything, but if I release it, they'll destroy me." "Not if it comes from multiple sources simultaneously. I've got my own recordings, and there are others, scientists who've grown uncomfortable with the weapons application. Military personnel who believe this violates treaties. We release together. They can't suppress it all. The engines coughed to life just as lights appeared on the horizon, vehicles approaching fast. "Go!" Johnson shouted. "I'll delay them." Mason didn't argue. He pushed the throttles forward, the old Buffalo lurching into motion. The ice runway wasn't lit, but the aurora provided enough illumination. As he lifted off, he saw Johnson's snowmobile racing toward the approaching vehicles, playing chicken with military precision. The flight to Yellowknife was the longest 2 hours of Mason's life. No radio contact. That would give away his position. Flying low to avoid radar, navigating by compass and instinct, expecting at any moment to see fighter jets appearing on his tail. But he made it. At Yellowknife Airport, he didn't go to the North Star hangar. Instead, he landed at the general aviation area, where Tobias waited with a van. "Drive," Mason said, climbing in. "Alaska. I have a contact at Elmendorf Air Force Base who'll help us get this to the right people." As they drove south, Mason uploaded the video to 17 different servers, each with a dead man's switch. If he didn't check in every 24 hours, the footage would automatically release to major news outlets, WikiLeaks, and every government oversight committee he could think of. His phone, Tobias's spare, rang immediately. Unknown Virginia number. "Mr. Fry, you're making a serious mistake." It was a new voice, older, with the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "The only mistake was thinking you could test weapons on Allied facilities without consequences. You don't understand the geopolitical implications. China and Russia are developing similar capabilities. If our research becomes public, it accelerates their programs. Maybe if it's public, there'll be pressure for treaties, for control. You're naive. Release that footage and you'll be charged under the Espionage Act. You'll spend the rest of your life in federal prison. Only if you can find me." Mason hung up and removed the phone's battery. They drove for 18 hours straight, crossing into British Columbia, then Alaska. At the border, Mason expected trouble, but Johnson had apparently worked magic. Their crossing was smooth, no alerts, no delays. Act 5, The Showdown. Mason's contact at Elmendorf was Captain Sarah Park, an intelligence officer he'd worked with in Afghanistan. She met them at a truck stop outside Anchorage, her expression grim. "Mason, what have you gotten yourself into? There are flash alerts about you on every military and intelligence network. They're calling you a foreign agent, saying you stole classified materials." Mason handed her the micro SD card. "Watch this, then tell me who the real threat is." They sat in her car as she viewed the footage on a secure laptop. Her face went pale as she watched the test, heard Emily's casual admission about targeting Fort Greely. They actually hit our own base? Check the logs for that night. 15-minute communication blackout blamed on solar storm activity. Sarah pulled up the incident reports on her classified network. There it was. Fort Greely. Complete communications failure from 0347 to 0402 local time, attributed to extreme auroral electromagnetic interference. "They're testing weapons on American military installations," she breathed. "This is beyond illegal. It's an act of war against our own forces. Can you get this to someone who'll act on it?" Sarah was quiet for a moment. "I know someone at the Pentagon Inspector General's office. Someone who's been investigating black budget programs. But Mason, even with this evidence, they have resources you can't imagine. They'll discredit you, destroy your reputation, possibly worse. Then we don't give them just one target." Mason pulled out a list he and Tobias had compiled. 47 journalists, 12 congressional staffers, 8 foreign intelligence services who'd be very interested to know about an Arctic EMP weapon. We release simultaneously, globally. They can't suppress everyone. That could start a war. Or prevent one. If everyone knows about the weapon, it loses its strategic value. Sarah's phone buzzed. She checked it, then cursed. "Military police, heading this way." Someone tracked my vehicle. Through the truck stop window they could see vehicles approaching. Black SUVs, no plates, windows tinted. "Back door," Tobias said, already moving. They rushed through the kitchen, startling the cook, and out into the rear parking area. Sarah's personal vehicle, a nondescript Honda, was parked there. "Take my car," she said, tossing Mason the keys. "I'll deal with them. Buy you time." As they drove away, Mason saw in the mirror Sarah walking calmly toward the approaching SUVs, her hands visible, credentials ready. She was sacrificing her career, possibly her freedom, for the truth. They drove to a cabin Tobias knew, 40 miles from Anchorage. No cell coverage, completely off-grid. There, using a satellite internet connection that couldn't be traced to the location, they prepared to release everything. But Mason hesitated. "What's wrong?" Tobias asked. "Johnson, the Canadian agent, Sarah, others who've helped us. If we release this, they'll suffer too. Then we're selective. We redact names, protect sources, focus on the technology, the violation of treaties, the tests on allied facilities, make it about the program, not the people." They spent 6 hours editing, redacting, creating a package that exposed the Aurora Directive while protecting those who'd risked everything to help them. At midnight Alaska time, Mason hit send. Within minutes, his satellite connection was severed, but it was too late. The information was out, spreading across the internet like wildfire. The response was immediate and chaotic. The Pentagon denied everything. The Canadian government demanded explanations. Environmental groups seized on the wildlife deaths. Military families questioned whether other equipment failures had been tests. Mason and Tobias waited in the cabin, expecting arrest at any moment. Instead, 12 hours later, Sarah arrived. "You did it," she said, exhausted but smiling. "The Inspector General's office has launched a full investigation. Congress is demanding hearings. The program's been suspended pending review." "What about us?" Mason asked. "Am I going to prison?" "That's the interesting part. Officially, you don't exist right now. No charges have been filed, because filing charges would mean acknowledging what you exposed. You're in legal limbo." A week later, a different kind of visitor arrived at the cabin. Emily Reeves, no longer in military attire, but in civilian clothes that somehow made her look more dangerous. "Congratulations," she said, her tone neutral. "You've set back American electromagnetic defense research by a decade." "I exposed illegal weapons testing," Mason countered. "You exposed a program that would have guaranteed American military superiority for the next century. Do you think China isn't working on the same technology? Russia? They're probably thanking you right now." "Then maybe the solution is transparency, treaties, international oversight." Emily laughed. "You really are naive. But it doesn't matter now. The program's been shut down. The facility's being dismantled. Officially, it was all a failed renewable energy experiment, classified due to the proprietary technology involved. That's the cover story. It's a good one. It explains the secrecy, the military involvement, even the electromagnetic effects. The solar storm that night caused equipment malfunctions leading to false readings. No weapons, no conspiracy, just government incompetence and corporate greed. But we have the video. Deepfake technology is amazing these days, isn't it? Already experts are questioning the authenticity of your footage. In 6 months, it'll be dismissed as an elaborate hoax. She stood to leave, then paused at the door. You won. The program's dead. But you also lost, because now we're behind in a race you don't even know is being run. When the next Carrington event happens, and it will, and when someone else's electromagnetic weapons are the only things working afterward, remember that you had a chance to keep America ahead. After she left, Mason and Tobias sat in silence. "Did we do the right thing?" Tobias finally asked. "I don't know," Mason admitted, "but we did the only thing we could live with." Act 6. The Aftermath. 6 months later, Mason stood on a hillside in Montana, watching the northern lights dance across the sky. He'd bought a small ranch with the money from selling his story to a documentary filmmaker, though the documentary was marketed as speculative fiction based on true events, the only way to avoid lawsuits. The official story had held. Aurora Station was dismantled, its existence explained away as a failed green energy project that had wasted millions in taxpayer dollars. A few congressional hearings happened, Some bureaucrats were reassigned, and the whole thing faded from the news cycle within weeks. But Mason knew the truth hadn't died. It had just gone deeper. His phone buzzed. A new model, heavily encrypted, provided by a whistleblower organisation that had taken interest in his case. The message was from Johnson, the Canadian agent, using their agreed-upon code. Northern fishing trip was successful, caught several large ones. Weather patterns remain interesting. Translation. Canadian intelligence had secured evidence from Aurora Station and was monitoring similar activities elsewhere. Mason's laptop chimed with an encrypted email from Sarah Park, now a civilian after her forced retirement. She worked for an oversight organisation monitoring defence contractors, a watchdog with teeth, funded by tech billionaires worried about military overreach. 3 new renewable energy projects have been proposed, one in Norway, one in Tasmania, one in Patagonia, all in areas with high auroral or electromagnetic activity, all with the same contractor connections we documented. They're not stopping, just spreading out the research to avoid another concentrated target. Mason typed back, "Keep watching, we'll be ready." Tobias had moved to Montana too, setting up his radio equipment in a barn on Mason's property. He spent his nights monitoring the same frequencies, listening for the telltale pulses that would indicate resumed testing. "You know they're going to try again," Tobias said one evening as they watched the aurora together. "Different place, different cover story, but the same goal." "I know," Mason replied, "but now there are more of us watching. The network Sarah's building, Johnson's contacts, the scientists who've quietly left the program. We changed something." "What?" "The technology's still out there." "We changed the conversation. Before, it was a complete black box. Unlimited funding, zero oversight, no questions asked. Now, even if they restart, they know people are watching. They have to be more careful, more limited. And sometimes that's all you can hope for, not to stop something completely, but to slow it down enough that safeguards can catch up." A year after the Aurora Station revelation, Mason received an unexpected visitor. An elderly man, Russian accent thick despite decades in America, introduced himself as Viktor Petrov. "I designed the original device," he said simply. "Cosmos 2341. I defected in 1990, told the Americans everything about the satellite, but they didn't believe me about its full capabilities until it crashed and they recovered it. Why are you telling me this? Because I've spent 30 years watching them try to weaponize my creation. I designed it as a shield, protection against solar storms, a way to strengthen the magnetosphere. They turned it into a sword." Victor handed Mason a worn notebook, filled with equations and diagrams. "The counter-frequency," Victor explained. "Every electromagnetic weapon has an opposite wave that cancels it out. If they start testing again, broadcast this frequency. It will neutralize the pulse, make their weapon useless." "Why didn't you release this yourself?" "Who would believe an old Russian about American weapons? But you've already proven the truth once. You have credibility I never had." Mason studied the notebook. This could prevent them from ever developing the weapon, or force them to find a different approach, hopefully a less dangerous one. Technology always advances, Mason. The question is whether wisdom advances with it. 3 years passed. The Aurora Directive became a footnote in conspiracy forums, dismissed by mainstream media, but kept alive by a dedicated community of researchers. Mason continued flying cargo. Now for a small company he had started himself, serving remote communities across the Northwest. He kept his ears open, his contacts active, always watching for signs of renewed activity. Then, on a routine flight to Whitehorse, his instruments went haywire in a familiar pattern. He checked his coordinates, nowhere near any known facility. But below, barely visible through the snow, he glimpsed something that made his heart race. Vehicle tracks leading to a low mound in the terrain, communication towers that shouldn't exist, and the distinctive shimmer of camouflage netting. They'd started again. Different location, probably different country, but the same program. That night Mason activated the network. Within hours, journalists in 5 countries had the coordinates. Satellite imagery was purchased and analysed. Environmental groups dispatched teams to monitor wildlife. Sarah's organisation filed Freedom of Information requests with 17 different agencies. But this time, Mason also did something different. Using Tobias's radio equipment and Victor's notebook, he broadcast the counter-frequency directly at the site during their next test window. The results were immediate and dramatic. Instead of generating a controlled pulse, the facility experienced what witnesses described as the Northern Lights descending to Earth. A massive, uncontrolled electromagnetic discharge that destroyed every piece of electronic equipment within 5 miles, but, crucially, harmed no one. The facility was abandoned within a week. Emily Reeves made one last visit, finding Mason at his ranch. "That was you," she said. "It wasn't a question. The counter-frequency. You've made the entire concept obsolete." "Good." "You don't understand what you've done. That technology was our best shot at defending against solar storms, against electromagnetic attacks from other nations." "Then develop it openly," Mason interrupted, "with international cooperation, civilian oversight and safety protocols. Stop turning every discovery into a weapon." Emily studied him for a long moment. "You really believe that's possible?" "I believe it's necessary. The Aurora belongs to everyone, Emily. The moment you tried to weaponize it, you guaranteed someone would stop you." She left without another word. 2 months later, Mason read about a new international initiative, the Global Electromagnetic Defense Coalition, a joint effort between 12 nations to study and protect against solar storms and electromagnetic phenomena. The project would be based in Antarctica, with full transparency and civilian oversight. Emily was listed as the technical director. Epilogue. 5 years after Aurora Station, Mason stood in a classroom at the University of Alaska, guest lecturing for a course on environmental science and ethics. The professor had introduced him as a cargo pilot, with an interesting perspective on Arctic development. "The Arctic has always been a mirror," Mason told the students. "What we do there, hidden in the ice and isolation, reflects who we really are as a society. We can use it as a laboratory for weapons, or we can use it as a classroom for cooperation." A student raised her hand. "Is it true what they say online? That you exposed a secret weapon program?" Mason smiled. "I exposed what happened when good people convinced themselves that secrecy was more important than accountability. Whether it was weapons or whether research doesn't matter as much as the lesson. Power without oversight corrupts, whether that power is political, military or electromagnetic." After the lecture, Mason drove to a hillside overlooking Fairbanks. The Aurora was particularly active that night, sheets of green and gold rippling across the sky. His phone buzzed, a message from Tobias. "All quiet on the frequencies, looks like a peaceful night." Mason typed back, "For now, but we keep listening." As he watched the Aurora dance, natural, untamed, unweaponized, Mason reflected on the strange journey that had brought him here. He'd started as a cargo pilot just trying to make a living, stumbled onto a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government, and somehow emerged as an unlikely guardian of one of nature's most magnificent phenomena. The Aurora Directive was dead, but Mason knew the impulse behind it. The desire to control, to weaponize, to dominate would never fully die. There would always be those who looked at the beauty of the Northern Lights and saw only potential military advantage. But now there were also those who watched the watchers, who questioned the questioners, who demanded that some things remain beyond the reach of classification stamps and black budgets. His phone rang. Sarah Park. "Mason, you'll want to see this. New contract just went out for a bid. Something called the Thermosphere Research Initiative. Guess where it's being built?" "Where?" "Greenland. And guess who's listed as a technical consultant?" Mason didn't need to guess. The game was starting again, just with new players and new rules. "Send me everything," he said, "and contact Johnson. Tell him the fishing trip might need to head further north." As he drove back to his ranch, the Aurora continued its eternal dance above, beautiful and dangerous, natural and mysterious. Mason had won one battle, But the war between transparency and secrecy, between weapons and wonder, would continue as long as humans looked up at the lights and dreamed of harnessing heaven. But that was okay. Mason had learned something important in his fight against the Aurora Directive. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't defeating your enemies, but forcing them to play by better rules. The weapons researchers would continue their work, but now they did it knowing that someone, somewhere, was always watching, always ready to broadcast the counter-frequency that would turn their weapons into nothing more than an expensive light show. The Aurora belonged to everyone, and Mason Fry, cargo pilot turned reluctant guardian, would make sure it stayed that way. As he pulled up to his ranch, his radio crackled to life. Tobias's voice, excited. "Mason, you need to hear this. I'm picking up something new. Not pulses this time. It sounds almost like music." Mason smiled grimly and headed for the barn where Tobias kept his equipment. The work was never done, the mysteries never ended, and somewhere in the static between stations, in the frequencies that bounced off the ionosphere, new secrets were waiting to be discovered and, if necessary, exposed. The Aurora danced on, keeper of secrets, canvas for humanity's ambitions, and reminder that some forces of nature should remain forever wild. What if I told you that buried beneath the frozen wastelands of Alaska lies something that could change everything we know about human history? Something that's not ancient at all, but very much alive. Tonight's story comes from a request by Matul Patel 9283. Thank you for this incredible suggestion. If you have ideas for future stories, please leave them in the comments below. And if you enjoy these tales that blur the line between fact and fiction, don't forget to like and subscribe to Sleep Theories for more mysterious stories that will keep you wondering. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is what I found beneath 200 feet of Alaskan permafrost, and why the government wants me to forget it ever existed. I'm a civil engineer, nothing glamorous about it. I measure soil density, calculate load-bearing capacities, and make sure buildings don't sink into the ground. For 15 years, I've worked contracts across the country, from Florida swamplands to Nevada deserts. Alaska was supposed to be just another job. The US Army Corps of Engineers hired me in March 2023 to survey land stability for a proposed pipeline route. Nothing unusual there. Energy companies are always looking to move oil from point A to point B, and they need someone to tell them their pipes won't crack when the ground shifts. The pay was good, the timeline was reasonable, and I needed the work. The assignment took me to a stretch of wilderness about 60 miles northwest of Fairbanks. On paper, it looked simple, a 3-month survey of geological stability across a 40-mile corridor. I'd use ground-penetrating radar, seismographs and core samples to map what lay beneath the surface. Standard procedure. I should have known something was off when they gave me a satellite phone with specific instructions to check in every 12 hours. Weather can change fast up there, the project coordinator explained. We need to know you're alive. But Alaska's a dangerous place. People disappear into the wilderness all the time. It seemed reasonable. I flew into Fairbanks on a Tuesday in April, rented a heavy-duty pickup truck and loaded it with equipment. The drive to my assigned sector took 3 hours on increasingly rough roads. The last 20 miles were barely more than frozen tyre tracks cutting through endless stands of black spruce and birch. When I finally reached my starting coordinates, the silence was absolute. No wind, no animals, no aircraft overhead. Just me, my equipment, and thousands of square miles of nothing. That's when the work began, and that's when everything I thought I knew about the world started to unravel. The first week went exactly as planned. I established a base camp with a generator-powered trailer and methodically began surveying the proposed pipeline route. The ground-penetrating radar showed typical permafrost patterns, layers of ice and soil that had been frozen for millennia. My seismograph readings were clean, showing the kind of stable bedrock that pipeline engineers love to see. Core samples revealed nothing unusual, standard Arctic soil composition with good load-bearing characteristics. I was making excellent progress. Then, on day 8, something changed. I was setting up the radar array for the morning survey when I noticed interference patterns on my display. Instead of the usual chaotic scattering that indicates rock and soil, I was seeing geometric shapes. At first I assumed it was equipment malfunction. Electronic devices can act strangely in extreme cold, and I'd been pushing my gear hard. I recalibrated the radar, replaced cables, and ran diagnostic tests. Everything checked out perfectly, but the shapes remained straight lines, perfect 90-degree angles, and beneath everything a massive triangular form with sides that extended beyond my radar's maximum penetration depth of 200 feet. I switched to the seismograph, thinking maybe sound waves would give me different data. I set off small explosive charges and measured how the shock waves travelled through the ground. Standard geological surveying technique. The results made no sense. Sound waves were reflecting off something solid and geometrically perfect about 150 feet down. The reflection pattern showed clean edges, flat surfaces, and precise angles. In nature, you don't find precise angles. Rivers meander, mountains erode into curves, and rock formations crack in random patterns. This was something else entirely. I spent the rest of that day running every test I could think of. Different frequencies, multiple angles, overlapping surveys. Every single measurement confirmed the same impossible truth. There was a massive pyramid buried beneath the permafrost, and it was huge. My calculations suggested sides at least 800 feet long, significantly larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza. The depth readings indicated it was sitting on bedrock, which meant it had been built on the surface and then buried by millions of years of geological processes. Except that made no sense either. Alaska's geological history doesn't include ancient civilizations capable of megalithic construction. The entire region was under glacial ice, until relatively recently in geological terms. I sat in my trailer that night staring at the printouts and digital displays, trying to find any explanation that didn't challenge everything I understood about engineering and archaeology. Maybe it was a natural formation that just happened to look geometric. Maybe my instruments were picking up interference from buried metal or deposits. Maybe the extreme cold was affecting my equipment in ways I didn't understand. But deep down I knew I was looking at something artificial, something that had been deliberately constructed and then hidden beneath the ice. The question was, who built it, and why? I needed supplies, and more importantly, I needed to talk to someone who knew the area's history. The nearest settlement was a village called Yukon Crossing. Population 127 according to the road sign. It was a 40-minute drive south on a road that tested every shock absorber in my truck. Yukon Crossing looked like a lot of rural Alaskan towns. A handful of weathered buildings clustered around a general store and a combination post office-gas station. Most of the residents lived in trailer homes or log cabins scattered among the trees. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin grey columns against the bright spring sky. The general store served as the unofficial community centre. Inside, I found an elderly native Alaskan man named Joseph Kaltag behind the counter, selling everything from canned goods to ammunition to fishing gear. He looked like he'd been running the place for decades. "You're the pipeline engineer," he said before I could introduce myself. It wasn't a question. "Word travels fast," I replied. "Not much happens around here." He rang up my purchases: batteries, fuel canisters, and enough food to last another week. "You working up in the Forbidden Valley?" I looked up from counting cash. Forbidden Valley? Joseph's weathered face remained expressionless, but I caught something in his eyes. Concern, maybe, or warning. That's what my grandfather called it. Said the spirits there were angry, animals won't go near it, and hunters who get too close. He shrugged. "Their compasses don't work right." "Magnetic interference," I said automatically. "Probably iron ore deposits in the bedrock. Maybe," he handed me my change, "or maybe some things are better left buried." I was loading supplies into my truck when a younger native woman approached. She introduced herself as Marie Kaltag, Joseph's granddaughter, and a pilot who flew supply runs to remote camps throughout the region. "I heard you talking to Grandpa," she said, "about the valley where you're working." He mentioned compass problems. Marie glanced around to make sure no one was listening. "It's more than that. I've flown over that area maybe 50 times in the last 10 years. My instruments go crazy. GPS cuts out, radio gets static, engine RPMs fluctuate." "Electromagnetic interference," I suggested. That's what I thought too. But 3 years ago I was flying a supply run to a hunting camp about 20 miles north of your work site. Clear day, perfect visibility. I was following the river when my GPS started spinning. Compass needle was rotating like a clock hand. She paused, clearly uncomfortable with the memory. I looked down to try to navigate by landmarks, and I saw something that shouldn't have been there. Lines in the snow, geometric patterns like someone had carved designs into the landscape. They were huge, maybe a mile across and perfectly symmetrical. Could have been natural formations, wind patterns, erosion channels. Marie shook her head. "I've been flying over Alaska my whole life. I know what natural looks like. This was artificial. And when I flew back over the same area a week later, the lines were gone, covered by fresh snow." I thanked her for the information and headed back to camp, but I couldn't stop thinking about what she'd said. Geometric patterns in the snow, electromagnetic interference, compasses spinning wildly. It all pointed to the same conclusion I was trying to avoid. Something beneath the permafrost was actively affecting the environment around it. That night, I reviewed my survey data again, looking for any detail I might have missed. The pyramid structure was consistent across all my measurements, but there was something else. Subtle variations in the electromagnetic readings that suggested complex internal architecture. Whatever was down there, it wasn't just a solid mass of stone. It had chambers, passages, and what looked like intricate internal mechanisms. And according to my instruments, some of those mechanisms were drawing electrical current. I woke up on day 12 to the sound of helicopter rotors. From my trailer window I could see a Black Hawk settling onto a flat area about 200 yards from my camp. No military markings, but the aircraft had the unmistakable look of government hardware. 3 men in winter camouflage climbed out as the rotors spun down. They walked directly to my trailer with the confident stride of people who expected cooperation. The leader was a tall man with close-cropped hair and reflective sunglasses. His companions looked like soldiers trying to dress like civilians, too alert, too fit, and carrying themselves like they had weapons hidden under their jackets. "Mr. Harrison," the leader said, reading my name from a tablet. "I'm Agent Collins, Department of Homeland Security. We need to discuss your recent survey findings." I stepped outside, keeping my expression neutral. I wasn't aware DHS had jurisdiction over pipeline surveys. "We have jurisdiction over potential national security threats." Collins gestured toward my equipment array. "Your seismic activity has been flagged by our monitoring systems. We need to examine your data and confiscate any materials related to subsurface anomalies." "What subsurface anomalies?" Collins removed his sunglasses, revealing pale blue eyes that seemed to look right through me. "Mr. Harrison, we know exactly what you found down there. The question is whether you're going to cooperate voluntarily or make this difficult. I had 2 choices. hand over my data willingly or watch them take it by force. Either way, they were getting what they wanted. "The hard drives are in the trailer," I said. One of Colin's men immediately headed inside while the other began disconnecting my external monitoring equipment. They worked with practiced efficiency, clearly familiar with this type of confiscation. "How long have you known it was there?" I asked. Collins was quiet for a long moment, apparently deciding how much to tell me. "The structure first appeared on our deep scanning systems in 1992. We've been monitoring it ever since." "Appeared? You mean you discovered it in 1992? "No, Mr. Harrison. I mean it appeared in 1992. Prior to that date, our scans showed normal bedrock composition. Then something changed." The man emerging from my trailer handed Collins a bag containing my hard drives and backup storage devices. They had also taken my printed survey maps and handwritten notes. 1992, I said, thinking out loud. That's when China conducted their largest underground nuclear test. Collins' expression didn't change, but I caught a flicker of something. Surprise, maybe, that I'd made that connection. "The Lopner test was 3,800 miles away," he said. "There's no possible connection." But his tone suggested otherwise, and I remembered something from my geological studies. Seismic waves from large underground explosions can travel through the Earth's crust and trigger responses in sensitive areas thousands of miles away. What if the Chinese nuclear test had somehow activated whatever was buried beneath the Alaskan permafrost? "You're being reassigned," Collins continued, handing me an official-looking document. "Your contract has been terminated due to unforeseeable circumstances. A helicopter will arrive tomorrow morning to transport you back to Fairbanks." "What about my equipment?" "It's been contaminated by proximity to hazardous materials. Standard decontamination procedures require disposal." That was obviously a lie. There were no hazardous materials in the area. I'd have detected them during my survey. They were confiscating everything because they didn't want me to have any physical evidence of what I'd found. "One more thing," Collins said as his team prepared to leave. "You'll be required to sign a non-disclosure agreement before returning to civilian areas. The penalty for violating that agreement is 10 years in federal prison." They climbed back into their helicopter and lifted off, leaving me alone with my suddenly empty trailer and a growing certainty that I'd stumbled into something much bigger than a pipeline survey. But I still had one advantage. They thought they'd taken all my data. They were wrong. I've always been paranoid about data backup. Too many years of watching hard drives crash and taking blame for lost survey information. So I keep a small handheld GPS unit with built-in memory storage that automatically logs all my location coordinates and instrument readings. Collins and his team had missed it because it was clipped to my belt, looked like standard hiking gear, and wasn't connected to my main computer systems. That night I reviewed the stored data on the device's tiny screen. Everything was there. Coordinates, depth readings, electromagnetic measurements, and seismic mapping data. Enough information to prove that something massive and artificial was buried beneath the permafrost. But proof wasn't enough. I needed to understand what it was and why the government was so determined to keep it secret. I made a decision that probably should have gotten me killed. I was going back to the site for one final investigation. The helicopter pickup was scheduled for 8 a.m, which gave me about 6 hours of darkness to work with. I loaded basic equipment into my backpack: a handheld GPS, the digital camera, a small electromagnetic field detector, and a battery-powered radio, and hiked back to the survey area. The night was clear and bitterly cold. My breath formed ice crystals that seemed to hang in the air, and the snow crunched under my boots with sounds like breaking glass. Above me, the aurora borealis painted green curtains across the star-filled sky. I reached the coordinates where my instruments had detected the pyramid's apex. According to my calculations, I was standing directly above the structure's highest point, about 120 feet below my boots. The handheld detector immediately started showing readings. Electromagnetic activity was significantly higher than background levels, and it seemed to be increasing. The device's small screen showed wave patterns that looked almost like a heartbeat, regular pulses of energy rising and falling in consistent cycles. I took photos of the instrument readings and recorded GPS coordinates, building a digital record that I could hopefully smuggle out of Alaska. But as I worked, something strange began happening. The aurora overhead was changing. Instead of the usual flowing curtains of light, it was forming geometric patterns, straight lines and angular shapes that mirrored the underground structure. It was as if the buried pyramid was somehow influencing the electromagnetic phenomena in the upper atmosphere. That's when I felt the vibration. It started as a barely perceptible tremor in the ground, like the feeling of a distant freight train. But it quickly intensified until I could feel it in my bones, a deep, rhythmic pulsing that seemed to synchronize with the electromagnetic readings on my detector. The device's screen was flashing warnings. Energy levels were spiking far beyond anything I'd measured during my official survey. Whatever was buried down there was waking up. I started backing away from the site, but before I could get more than 50 yards, everything electronic I carried died simultaneously. The GPS unit, the detector, my digital camera, even my LED flashlight, all dead, as if something had delivered a massive electromagnetic pulse. Above me, the aurora was blazing brighter than I had ever seen, forming complex geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. The air itself seemed to be humming with energy, and I could feel static electricity building up on my clothing and exposed skin. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The aurora faded back to normal patterns. The ground vibration ceased. The electrical sensation disappeared. I was left standing in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness in complete darkness, holding a handful of dead electronics. I stumbled back toward camp using starlight for navigation, reaching my trailer just before dawn. When I tried to start my truck, the engine turned over immediately. Apparently whatever had killed my handheld electronics hadn't affected the vehicle's more robust electrical system. But I knew what I had experienced wasn't natural. The buried pyramid wasn't just an ancient artifact or geological formation. It was some kind of active installation that could influence electromagnetic fields across a wide area. The question was, what was its purpose? The helicopter arrived exactly at 8 a.m, piloted by a civilian contractor who seemed unaware that he was participating in a government cover-up. During the flight back to Fairbanks, I signed the non-disclosure agreement Collins had mentioned, legally binding myself to remain silent about my discoveries. But signing the paper didn't erase my memory, and it didn't eliminate the data I'd managed to keep hidden. I flew back to Seattle that afternoon and spent the next 2 weeks trying to return to normal life. I updated my resume, contacted potential clients, and attempted to focus on finding my next engineering contract. But I couldn't stop thinking about what lay buried beneath the Alaskan permafrost. Late one night, unable to sleep, I sat down with my laptop and started researching everything I could find about electromagnetic anomalies, underground structures, and the 1992 Chinese nuclear test that Agent Collins had mentioned. What I discovered changed everything. The Chinese test, conducted at the Lop Nür facility on May 21, 1992, was indeed one of the largest underground nuclear explosions ever detonated. The blast was so powerful that seismic monitoring stations around the world recorded the shockwaves as they travelled through the Earth's crust. But that wasn't the interesting part. I found archived scientific papers describing unusual electromagnetic phenomena that occurred globally in the days following the test. Radio disruptions, satellite communication failures, and compass anomalies were reported from locations thousands of miles away from the blast site. Most significantly, several research stations in Alaska reported sudden spikes in local electromagnetic activity, beginning approximately 6 hours after the Chinese detonation. Exactly the amount of time it would take seismic waves to travel through the Earth's crust from Lop Nür to Alaska. I cross-referenced these reports with geological surveys of the Alaskan region and found something that made my blood run cold. Every single electromagnetic anomaly had been reported from locations within a 50-mile radius of my survey site. Whatever was buried there had indeed been activated by the Chinese nuclear test, just as Collins had implied, but the implications went far beyond a simple cause and effect relationship. I started plotting the locations of other reported anomalies on a world map, looking for patterns. What I found was a global network of similar sites, places where electromagnetic activity had spiked following major seismic events, underground installations that seemed to respond to specific triggers. The more I researched, the more convinced I became that the Alaskan pyramid wasn't unique. It was part of a worldwide system of buried structures, all apparently designed to respond to geological disturbances, but designed by whom, and for what purpose? I thought back to the night I'd witnessed the energy pulse, remembering how the aurora borealis had formed geometric patterns directly above the burial site. Aurora phenomena are caused by charged particles from the sun interacting with Earth's magnetic field. If the underground structure could influence those interactions, it was essentially broadcasting energy into space. What if the buried pyramids weren't ancient monuments at all? What if they were communication devices, a global network designed to transmit signals to somewhere far beyond Earth? The possibility was terrifying and fascinating in equal measure. If I was right, then humanity shared the planet with technology that predated our entire civilization by potentially millions of years. Technology that was still active, still responding to triggers, still sending messages to unknown recipients. I spent weeks researching similar sites around the world, building a database of locations where unusual electromagnetic phenomena had been reported following major seismic events. The pattern that emerged was undeniable. A global network of transmission stations, all apparently activated by disturbances in the Earth's crust. But before I could take my research any further, I received a letter that ended my investigation permanently. The letter arrived exactly 1 month after my return from Alaska. It was delivered by certified mail to my apartment address, though I hadn't given that information to anyone connected with the pipeline project. The return address showed only Department of Interior Special Projects Division, with a Washington, D.C. postal box number. Inside was a single page of official letterhead containing a brief message. Mr. Harrison, this communication serves as final notice regarding your terminated contract with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, project classification, Black Ice. Subsequent to your departure from the survey area, additional geological analysis has determined that the subsurface structure you detected is not archaeological in nature. The structure is an active installation of unknown origin that poses potential risks to national security. Any attempt to publicise information related to this discovery will result in immediate prosecution under the Espionage Act of 1917. Your signed non-disclosure agreement remains in full effect indefinitely. The installation you discovered is not a relic. It is a machine. Do not pursue further inquiry. Sincerely, Director, Special Projects Division. I read the letter 3 times before the full implication sank in. They weren't denying what I'd found. They were confirming it. The underground structure was artificial. It was active. And the government had known about it for over 30 years without understanding what it was or who had built it. But the most chilling aspect was the letter's final warning. It is a machine. Not a monument. Not an archaeological site. Not a natural formation. A machine. I thought about the energy pulse I'd witnessed, the geometric patterns in the aurora, the electromagnetic signals that seemed to respond to seismic events around the world. If the buried pyramid was indeed a machine, then its purpose was clear. It was designed to detect and respond to geological disturbances by transmitting signals into space. The question remained, signals to whom? I locked the letter in a safety deposit box along with copies of all my survey data and research findings. If something happened to me, at least there would be evidence that the discovery had been made. But I never published my findings. I never contacted journalists or researchers or anyone else who might be interested in the truth about what lay beneath the Alaskan permafrost, because I realised that some knowledge carries a price too high to pay. If there really was a global network of alien communication devices buried beneath our feet, broadcasting our planet's geological status to unknown recipients in space, then humanity was living on borrowed time. We were tenants on a world that belonged to someone else, someone who had installed monitoring equipment long before our species existed. The machines weren't dormant relics of an ancient civilization. They were active components of a surveillance system that was still operational after millions of years. And every earthquake, every volcanic eruption, every nuclear test was sending updates to whoever had built them. I returned to my normal life as a civil engineer, taking contracts that kept me far from Alaska and far from any situation that might uncover similar installations. I told myself that ignorance was safer than knowledge, that some secrets were better left buried. But sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I think about that machine humming beneath the permafrost. I wonder if it's still transmitting. I wonder who's listening. And I wonder what they plan to do when they decide we've learned too much about the world we think we own. For 6 months, I managed to convince myself that forgetting was possible. I took contracts in familiar territories, building inspections in suburban developments, soil analysis for shopping mall construction, routine work that involved nothing more mysterious than concrete and rebar. Then the dream started. At first they were just fragments, flashes of geometric light, the sound of deep humming that seemed to vibrate through my bones, the sensation of standing on solid ground while everything around me pulsed with invisible energy. I'd wake up with my heart racing and a metallic taste in my mouth as if I'd been breathing electrified air. But the dreams became more vivid as weeks passed. I began seeing the pyramid not from above, as I had during my survey, but from within. Vast chambers carved from black stone that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. Corridors that stretched beyond the reach of any illumination, filled with the constant sound of machinery that had been running for millennia. In these dreams, I wasn't alone. Shadowy figures moved through the passages, tall, elongated forms that seemed more like geometric projections than living beings. They moved with purpose, tending to controls and displays that covered the walls in intricate patterns of light and symbol. The most disturbing part was that they seemed aware of me. In the dreams, they would pause their activities and turn toward me with attention that felt like cold judgment. Without faces I could recognize, without voices I could understand, they somehow communicated a single clear message. I had seen something I wasn't meant to see. I consulted a sleep specialist, thinking the dreams were delayed stress responses from my time in Alaska. She prescribed medication that helped me fall asleep but didn't stop the visions. If anything, the drugs made them more intense, more real, more impossible to dismiss as products of an overwrought imagination. It was during one of these medicated dreams that I saw something new, a global map covered in points of light, each one marking a location where similar pyramids lay buried. The network stretched across every continent, even beneath the ocean floors, hundreds of installation sites, all connected by lines of energy that pulsed in synchronized patterns. I woke from that dream with absolute certainty that I was seeing something real. The buried machines weren't isolated installations. They were nodes in a planetary communication grid that spanned the entire world. 3 days later, I made a decision that changed everything. I started investigating again. Using the global locations from my dreams as starting points, I began researching electromagnetic anomalies and unexplained phenomena at similar sites around the world. What I found was a pattern so consistent it couldn't be coincidental. Every location where I dreamed of seeing a pyramid corresponded to a place where unusual events had been reported. The Nazca lines in Peru, built over an area where aircraft instruments malfunctioned regularly. The underwater structures near Bimini in the Bahamas, where submarines had reported mechanical failures and compass deviations. The Giza Plateau in Egypt, where modern surveys had detected massive voids beneath the known pyramids. Each site shared common characteristics: electromagnetic interference, geometric precision in ancient or unexplained structures, and a history of covering up or dismissing scientific findings that couldn't be easily explained. But the most significant pattern was temporal. Every site had experienced increased activity following major seismic events, exactly like the Alaskan installation after the 1992 Chinese nuclear test. I compiled a database of seismic events and electromagnetic anomalies dating back 50 years. The correlation was undeniable. Large earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and underground nuclear tests consistently triggered responses from specific locations around the globe. The buried machines weren't just monitoring geological activity, they were responding to it, broadcasting information about Earth's internal dynamics to receivers beyond our planet. I was building a case for the existence of a global alien surveillance network when I made a discovery that terrified me more than anything I'd found so far. The activity was increasing. According to my research, electromagnetic anomalies at these sites had been relatively stable for decades, showing only minor fluctuations in response to major geological events. But starting in 2020, the baseline activity levels had begun rising at all locations simultaneously. Something was changing. The network was becoming more active, more responsive, more awake. I plotted the activity increases on a timeline and noticed they correlated with something unexpected. The global increase in seismic activity over the past few years. More earthquakes, more volcanic eruptions, more geological instability than had been recorded in previous decades. What if the relationship wasn't cause and effect? What if the buried machines weren't just monitoring geological activity? What if they were causing it? The possibility was so disturbing I initially dismissed it as paranoid speculation, but the more I studied the data, the more compelling the evidence became. The timing was too precise, the correlations too consistent. If I was right, then humanity was living on a planet where alien technology was actively destabilizing the geological systems that supported all life on Earth. But why? What possible purpose could be served by triggering earthquakes and volcanic eruptions? The answer came to me during another dream, but this time I was prepared. I had set up a digital recorder beside my bed, hoping to capture any words or sounds I might make while experiencing the visions. What I heard when I played back the recording the next morning was my own voice, but speaking words I didn't remember saying. Stress testing, planetary stability assessment, structural analysis phase approaching completion. I'd somehow been speaking in the technical language of engineering, describing the geological chaos as if it were a planned evaluation of the planet's physical integrity. The machines weren't trying to destroy Earth, they were testing it. Over the following weeks, I dove deeper into geological data, looking for patterns that might support my terrifying hypothesis. What I found convinced me that the buried network was conducting a systematic analysis of Earth's structural stability. Seismic events weren't random, they were following a pattern. Stress points in tectonic plates were being tested in sequence, as if something was methodically evaluating how much pressure the planet's crust could withstand before catastrophic failure. The 2011 Japanese earthquake and tsunami, the 2010 Haiti earthquake, the increasing volcanic activity in Indonesia, Italy and Iceland, the unprecedented earthquake swarms in places like Oklahoma and Arkansas. All of these events clustered around locations where I'd identified buried installations. I created detailed models showing how the network might be triggering these events through focused electromagnetic pulses directed at specific geological fault lines. The technology required would be far beyond human capabilities, but for a civilization that could build planet-spanning monitoring networks, it would be routine engineering. But the most chilling aspect of my research was the timeline. If the current rate of geological testing continued, the network would have evaluated every major tectonic system on Earth within the next 5 to 10 years. What would happen when the testing phase was complete? I spent sleepless nights imagining scenarios, planetary mining operations that required clearing the surface of inconvenient biological life, terraforming projects that would remake Earth's atmosphere and geology, or simple property reclamation by the network's builders returning to a world they had left unattended for millennia. None of the possibilities included a future for human civilization. It was during this period of growing despair that I received an unexpected contact that changed everything once again. The email appeared in my inbox on a Tuesday morning with a subject line that made my blood freeze. Alaskan survey data, classification black ice. The sender's address was scrambled text that looked like a random string of characters, clearly routed through multiple encryption services to hide its origin. But the message content was brief and specific. Mr. Harrison, we know what you've discovered about the global network. Your research parallels investigations conducted by others who have encountered similar installations. A meeting has been arranged. Be at the Starbucks on Pine Street in downtown Seattle tomorrow at 3 p.m. Come alone. Bring your data. You're not the only one who has seen the machines. The message included no signature, but attached to it was a single photograph that made my hands shake, an image of my own survey equipment at the Alaskan site, taken from an angle that suggested the photographer had been watching my investigation from a significant distance. Someone had been monitoring me during my time in Alaska, someone who wasn't part of Agent Collins' government team. I spent the entire night debating whether to attend the meeting. It could be a trap, government agents trying to identify how much I knew and what evidence I still possessed. Or it could be exactly what it claimed, contact with others who had discovered the truth about the buried network. In the end, curiosity won over caution. I needed to know if I was really alone in this knowledge, or if there were others working to understand the threat humanity was facing. The Starbucks was crowded with the usual mix of students, business people and remote workers when I arrived at exactly 3 p.m. I ordered coffee and found a table near the back, trying to identify anyone who might be waiting for me. At 3:15, a woman in her 50s approached my table. She had greying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wore field clothing that suggested outdoor work, and carried herself with the confident posture of someone accustomed to physical challenges. "Mr. Harrison," she extended her hand. "I'm Catherine Webb. I think we need to talk." She sat down across from me and immediately began speaking in low, urgent tones. "I'm a marine archaeologist. 3 years ago, I was leading a deep-sea survey off the coast of Bermuda, when my team discovered an underwater structure that shouldn't exist. Geometric, massive, and actively generating electromagnetic fields that interfered with our equipment. She opened a tablet and showed me sonar images that looked remarkably similar to my ground-penetrating radar data from Alaska. A pyramid-shaped structure, perfectly symmetrical, sitting on the ocean floor at a depth of nearly a mile. When we tried to publish our findings, the research was classified and our funding was terminated. Sound familiar? I nodded, unable to speak. Catherine continued, but I kept investigating privately. I found evidence of at least 12 similar installations in deep ocean locations around the world. All of them show the same characteristics: geometric precision, electromagnetic activity, and apparent activation following seismic events. She showed me more images: underwater structures near Japan, the Mediterranean, the mid-Atlantic ridge. Each one was clearly artificial, clearly ancient, and clearly active. "There are others," she said. "A geologist in Australia who found similar structures in the outback. An archaeologist in Egypt who discovered chambers beneath the Sphinx that contain technology that shouldn't exist. A seismologist in Chile who documented electromagnetic pulses preceding earthquake activity. How many others? We've identified 17 researchers worldwide who have encountered installations or phenomena that appear to be part of the same network. Most have been silenced through official pressure, funding cuts, or career destruction. A few have simply disappeared." Catherine leaned closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "But some of us have continued working in secret. We've been sharing data, building a comprehensive picture of what we're dealing with. And what are we dealing with? A global surveillance and control system that's been operating for thousands of years, possibly millions. The installations aren't just monitoring Earth, they're managing it, controlling geological processes, atmospheric composition, even biological evolution through environmental manipulation. The implications hit me like a physical blow. We're not alone on this planet. We never have been. The question is whether humanity developed naturally, or whether we're the result of controlled biological development guided by whoever built the network." Catherine showed me more data, archaeological evidence of genetic bottlenecks in human evolution that corresponded to periods of unusual geological activity, atmospheric changes that seemed to follow patterns rather than random climate variation, even extinction events that appeared to have been artificially triggered. "The network has been shaping Earth's development for millions of years," she said. "Every mass extinction, every ice age, every major evolutionary leap has been guided by the installations. But why? What's the purpose?" Catherine's expression was grim. "We think Earth is being prepared for something. The stress testing you've documented, the increasing seismic activity, the atmospheric changes, it all points to final preparations for some kind of major transition." "Transition to what?" "We don't know. But based on the escalating activity levels, we estimate it will begin within the next few years." She handed me a secure phone with an encrypted communication app. If you want to help us understand what we're facing, this will put you in contact with the others. We're working to decode transmissions from the installations to map the complete network, and to find some way to predict what's coming. What if we can't stop it? Catherine was quiet for a long moment. Then at least humanity will know the truth before the end. Over the following months, I became part of an underground network of researchers from around the world. Using encrypted communications and careful operational security, we shared data, theories, and discoveries about the installations that had consumed our professional lives. What emerged from our collective research was a picture of Earth that challenged everything humanity believed about our planet and our place in the universe. The installation network was vast. Over 300 confirmed sites across all continents and ocean floors. Each site contained structures of identical design but varying scale, all built from materials that didn't match any known geological formations. The construction showed evidence of technology far beyond human capabilities, with precision that exceeded our best modern engineering. But the most significant discovery came from Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a linguist and cryptographer in Japan who'd been analysing electromagnetic transmissions intercepted from the installations. The transmissions weren't random energy pulses. They were coded communications in a mathematical language that described Earth's physical and biological status in incredible detail. Real-time reports on atmospheric composition, geological stability, ocean chemistry, magnetic field fluctuations and biological diversity levels. More disturbing were the projections embedded in the transmissions, mathematical models showing how Earth systems would respond to various environmental stresses, including massive geological disruptions, atmospheric changes and population adjustments. The network was continuously updating these models based on data from the stress testing we documented. Each earthquake, each volcanic eruption, each environmental change provided new information that refined the projections, and all of the models pointed to the same conclusion: a massive intervention scheduled to begin when current biological systems reached predetermined stress thresholds. We were approaching those thresholds rapidly. Climate change, resource depletion, ecological collapse, and social instability were all being monitored by the network. But rather than random consequences of human activity, they appeared to be planned phases in a managed transition process. Humanity hadn't created the environmental crisis. We were living through the final stages of a controlled experiment that had been running for thousands of years. The realization was overwhelming. Every environmental disaster, every resource shortage, every social conflict was part of a planned sequence designed to bring Earth's biological systems to a specific end state. But what would replace them? The answer came from an unexpected source: my dreams. As I became more deeply involved with the research network, my nighttime visions became more detailed and informative. I was seeing not just the installations, but the purpose they served. The geometric beings I encountered in the dreams weren't aliens. They were artificial intelligences, created by the network's builders to manage Earth's transition through automated systems. The real builders were gone, had been gone for millions of years, but they had left behind a planetary management system designed to prepare Earth for their eventual return. The stress testing, the environmental manipulation, the biological management, it was all preparation for recolonization by a species that had left Earth eons ago and was now ready to reclaim it. But sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I think about that machine humming beneath the permafrost. I wonder if it's still transmitting. I wonder who's listening. And I wonder what they plan to do when they decide we've learned too much about the world we think we own. Because now I know the truth. We are temporary occupants of a world that has always belonged to someone else. The installations beneath our feet are counting down to a transition that will remake Earth according to specifications we cannot understand for purposes we cannot imagine. The truth is out there, buried beneath the ice in places like Alaska, waiting for the next contractor or surveyor or accidental discoverer to stumble across it. When that happens, and it will happen eventually, I hope they're wiser than I was. I hope they don't go back for one final look in the darkness, because some machines are better left undisturbed, and some signals are better left unsent. but the signals are being sent anyway, carrying reports of a planet ready for reclamation by its original inhabitants. The countdown has begun, and we are running out of time to understand what we're facing, or to find a way to survive what's coming.